Chapter 753. The fiery red crystal sword stabbed into the hollow leg bone, and countless explosions sounded from inside. A terrifying, vibrating power quickly passed through the two's bodies. Without any hesitation, Zhao Miao abandoned her sword. She let go of the crystal sword in her hand and used her body to crash into Qi Siren's arms. This was an even more suicidal presence. So while she had abandoned her sword essence did not weaken at all. Qi Siren let out a low roar. He had used two legendary legacy talismans to try to trap Zhao Miao's sword essence. But this famed fourth Mr. Zhao was more terrifying than he had imagined. As he roared, he, who rarely retreated when facing an enemy, furiously retreated. A string of black shadows appeared in front of him. As he rapidly retreated, his left hand passed by Su Qin's body. Su Qin was pulled by him like a weightless ball of air and retreated with him. The black shadows in front of him were not completely illusory and carried an indescribable coldness and stickiness. Balls of crimson flames and green smoke exploded around the advancing Zhao Miao. However, the distance between her and Qi Siren was always 1 zhang. 10 feet was the limit of a cultivator's limit. Qi Siren looked at Zhao Miao's burning eyes. He sensed the exhaustion of vital energy in his body. He finally stopped hesitating and awakened the deathly still presence in his energy Sea Jade Palace. He reached out and pressed his hand against the forehead of Zhao Miao, who was charging in front of him. Zhao Miao's body was covered in tempered true fire. At this time, she was the sword, and any part of her body was the edge of the sword. No matter where Qi Siren's hand landed on her body, it was no different from landing on the edge of the sword. Normally, even if Yuan Wu's hand landed on her forehead in the next moment, his hand would be shattered to pieces and then burned to ash. However, when Qi Siren's hand landed on Zhao Miao's forehead, both of their bodies trembled. There wasn't even the sound of bones cracking in his arm. This was unimaginable. Zhao Miao was also in a state of endless shock. She looked up in shock at the arm that was holding down a naughty child. The first thing she saw was countless wisps of black gas seeping out from Qi Siren's skin. Then, the hair on his arm began to grow at a terrifying speed. At the same time, the skin, flesh, and even bones on his arm began to change. In the next instant, this arm had completely changed, becoming as large as Qi Siren's body. It was covered in countless scale-like black spots, and its nails were as sharp as flying swords. Most importantly, there was a terrifying roar coming from the inside of the arm. This arm was no longer the arm of a cultivator. Instead, it was the arm of some kind of monstrous beast. Zhao Miao felt a strong aura of death. Corpse-raising technique. She finally came to her senses and cried out. Qi Siren did not give any response. At this moment, a thought-provoking expression appeared on his face. In the next moment, his arm could not endure the power of Zhao Miao's sword and exploded from the inside, shattering into countless pieces. But the impact in this instant pushed Zhao Miao's body back 100 zhang. With a boom, she smashed into the graves behind her, creating waves of dust. Qi Siren's arm disappeared like it had melted into the night. Then, his and Su Qin's bodies quickly faded and disappeared in the night. In just a short moment, while the dust was still flying into the sky, Zhao Miao's figure had already passed through the waves of dust. She was in a sorry state. Her body was covered in dust, and even her clothes had several holes in them. However, her expression was extremely solemn. Her entire body was still shining with a blazing sword light. No one would find it funny if they saw it. She had already lost track of Qi Siren in her perception. In the end, she was unable to keep Qi Siren in this battle. But she did not feel any dejection. Instead, she felt some admiration for Qi Siren's methods. Some sects in the Qi dynasty could raise a kind of corpse beast. This was a method of using yin energy to forcefully change the corpses of some beasts, turning these lifeless beasts into unique walking corpses. Because there was no fear, and they were dead, unless the core in their bodies was destroyed, these corpse beasts would not lose their ability to fight. They were even more terrifying than when they were alive. The core in their bodies was a formation that continuously absorbed yin energy. As time passed, their power would grow, and they would even mutate further. But in the history of the cultivation world, there had never been a cultivator who cultivated yin energy that dared to take this kind of corpse beast into their body and use their own energy to feed it. It was like they were raising a life bond item. This was originally a kind of pioneering work, a challenge on the border of life and death. Because if some change occurred and could not be suppressed, then this kind of corpse beast would likely consume the cultivator themselves. Being able to use a powerful method passed down from the cultivation world to become a powerful cultivator was not enough to make Zhao Miao feel admiration. But Qi Siren's pioneering work truly made her feel respect. Even if she still had the power to fight, even if Qi Siren only fled in the end, just now, this battle was the most spirited battle she had had since she lost her life bond sword on the Wei River. If she still could not keep Qi Siren here, in her view, this battle was her loss. Qi Siren's body fell from the sky. Below him was a mountain valley. This was less than a dozen miles from the Chu capital. He may not be able to escape the pursuit of all cultivators, but his body had reached its limit. In order to raise the corpse beast in his body, he had used the most dangerous and safe method. He had the corpse beast in his energy, see, always sleep, and in its sleep, it would naturally absorb his energy and slowly mutate. His battle with Zhao Miao was completely in line with his plans. The moment he awakened the corpse beast, he used it as a shield to block the other's sword essence. This way, he could block the other's sword and use the other's sword essence to kill the corpse beast. He would not suffer a backlash when his vital energy was used up. But the true fire of the Zhao sword furnace was more effective against yin and ghosts than he had imagined. When the sword essence tore apart the corpse beast, the true fire still entered his body. Some of the shattered energy of the corpse beast invaded his body like poison. He had to force all of this energy out of his body. Otherwise, even he would slowly wither and die. He had to fight for time. The greatest threat still came from the people of the Bazin Kendo ground. Even if the experts of the Chu capital found his tracks, they would not have the courage to enter this ordinary mountain valley to fight him. So he quickly sat down cross-legged among the trees at the bottom of the valley and started to adjust his breathing. The thick, withered leaves of this valley contained the smell of decay. There were threads of energy visible to the naked eye. Under his channeling, they were like little black snakes coming out of the withered leaves and surging into his body. He calmed down slightly, yet after several dozen breaths, he felt an indescribable dark presence quietly enter his body along with the energy. It was like an invisible ghostly hand was gripping his heart. His breathing suddenly stopped. His perception fell to the left of his body, and he was filled with disbelief. To his left was Su Qin, whom he had casually tossed aside. Chapter 754. When one's energy sea was sealed, one could not use any vital energy. This was common knowledge in the cultivation world. Also, he was Qi Siren. Of all the cultivators in the Qi dynasty who cultivated the yin and ghost method, he was the first after Yanning. The yin and ghost method was based on eeriness and had all kinds of inconceivable methods. His method of sealing the energy sea was even more special. Even more importantly, he had walked a long way on the path of Realm 7. How could cultivators like Su Qin compare to the strength of his vital energy? Yet when he opened his eyes and saw the red light behind Su Qin, and the eerie but excited light in Su Qin's eyes, he knew that he had unintentionally made a terrifying mistake. Su Qin's body trembled violently. He stared hard at Qi Siren like he was looking at the most delicious food in the world. Numerous bloody lines pierced out of his chest like exposed blood vessels. At this time, the other end was connected to Qi Siren's body. In Qi Siren's eyes, Su Qin was still so weak, even a pitiful junior. But in his perception, Su Qin's body had become an enormous whirlpool. The giant whirlpool was filled with blood-red lines. These blood-red lines converged to form the shadow of the sorcerer god. Every part of Qi Siren's body instinctively wanted to break free of his connection with Su Qin. Yet a feeling of exhaustion and powerlessness spread through his body. It was not just that his wounds were too serious, and he had been ambushed when he was healing. Even more importantly, his vital energy was quickly disintegrating under the energy of the blood-red lines. Along with his vital energy, his blood and energies were also being pulled over. Injuries piled on top of injuries. The final result was complete collapse. As expected, you have mastered the method of the 12 shamans. Chi Siren looked at Su Qin's excited and hungry eyes and sighed. He had never thought that he would have such an ending. In all the endings he had imagined, even if he did not die under the swords of the top experts of the Bazinkindo ground, he would die in the battle with Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiao. But at this moment, other than a trace of sadness in his eyes, there was not much unwillingness. This was because he understood that he had not lost to Su Qin, but to the inconceivable technique of the 12 shamans. The qi and blood of a living person are completely different from the yin qi that has been transformed for many years. The clash of the 5 qis will cause diseases in the body, which is detrimental to cultivation. He looked at Su Qin, who was not responding at all and was only madly drawing out the vital energy and blood in his body. He did not want to scare Su Qin. This was a very simple principle. Even in the era when the yin and ghost methods were at their strongest, this principle had been proven many times. The simplest example was when a person's organs were implanted into another person's body. At first, everything was normal, but soon there would be an intrinsic rejection, and the organs would die. A cultivator's vital energy carried their own imprints. Only many years after a cultivator became a dead object, this vital energy would undergo a natural transformation and be changed by the world. Only then could some of it become yin energy that could be absorbed and used. But at this time, seeing Su Qin's madness, he knew that Su Qin would not stop. He was only speaking from the perspective of a senior, giving an evaluation of the cultivation method itself. For some reason, perhaps because Su Qin's energy was connected, he could understand Chi Siren's state of mind. But he still did not respond because Zhao Miao's appearance in the graveyard had not been arranged by him. But in the battle between Zhao Miao and Chi Siren had been seriously injured, and Zhao Miao's true fire energy had caused the vital energy in his body to loosen a bit. Adding on the shaman method itself, this chance to turn defeat into victory had appeared. Previously, he knew his fate after rejecting Chi Siren. He would become a soul, unable to escape, trapped in a dead body, and forever enslaved until his body and soul were destroyed. But now, not only could he survive, he could also refine the energy and blood of an expert like Chi Siren. This chance to turn defeat into victory, in his view, was the will of the heavens. This was a chance of fate. He could not waste it. That was why he waited until he sensed Chi Siren's blood and energy start to dry up, his life force starting to dissipate into death. Only then did he smile with a twisted expression and start to speak. He looked at Chi Siren, whose eyes were slowly darkening, and replied, "It will shorten one's lifespan. However, whether a person's life is exciting or not depends on how long they live, but on what position they can stand in." Chi Siren suddenly laughed as well. His body was turning cold, and he was about to fall into eternal death. But just now, he understood some things and thought of some interesting possibilities. If this result was the will of the heavens, then he decided to fulfill this will. The method is only the foundation, but there are many other methods to fight the enemy. He smiled and looked at Su Qin. He said calmly, "For ghostly beings, your past is blank, and you lack many necessary experiences. This will hinder you from becoming a true expert in the future. Many of the grandmasters of the Qi dynasty have all kinds of methods, but they lack the foundation of the 12 shamans. Why don't you think about it now? If your shaman method is combined with all the methods I know, what will the result be?" This was an indescribable connection. Su Qin immediately understood Chi Siren's meaning. His eyes lit up again. "I have faced the threat of the cultivators of the Qin dynasty my entire life. From the start of my cultivation, what my master taught me was to cultivate for the Qi dynasty, to resist the invasion of foreign enemies. Of all the foreign enemies, the strongest is naturally the Qin dynasty," Chi Siren said calmly. Chi Siren continued calmly, "However, the higher one's cultivation, the more one finds that it is impossible to defeat the people of the Qin dynasty. In the end, one is tired of running for one's life and doing their best to deal with them. All they want is to see the Qi collapse like the Chu in their lifetime. After a pause, Qi Siren's eyes could no longer be seen, but he still said calmly, "Now that I think about it, your previous suggestion was not bad. Maybe you and I can build a dynasty stronger than the Qin dynasty." Su Qin grew silent. But this silence only lasted for a few breaths because he knew Qi Siren's life was at its end. He asked seriously, "Are you not afraid that I will destroy the Qi instead? Your thoughts before death will be completely different from before. Maybe only then will you let go of your restraints, and your state of mind will be higher. Regardless of whether it is Qi Mie or Qin Mie, if you can win in the end, the winner will still be the cultivator of the ghostly method. What will be rebuilt is the glory of our ancestral master. This is actually the pursuit of any cultivator who cultivates the Yin and ghost cultivation method." Qi Siren's voice grew soft. In the end, he gripped a pendant hanging in front of him. Using his last strength, he handed it to Su Qin. Su Qin grew silent again. He looked at the dead Qi Siren and held the black bone piece in his hand. He could sense the countless fine characters carved on the bone piece. "If there is a so-called spirit in heaven, then bless me." He nodded to Qi Siren's body and slowly said, "If I succeed, I will have your name go down in history." Chapter 755. Some people pursued wealth and ease. However, the higher a person reached, the more they wanted to be able to control their own destiny. This was because they would discover that when they were unable to truly control their own destiny, the wealth and ease they had now would be lost at any time. A wealthy merchant in Chongling would most likely become penniless with just a thought from an important person. Su Qin looked at Qi Siren's body. He felt that he was stronger than Qi Siren because he only knew how to live for himself. In Yongfu County of Jiaodong Commandery, a fierce battle had ended. The remnants of the Chu army, the armies of the Nanquan commanderies, and the reinforcements from the Chu dynasty had destroyed the main force of the Jiaodong Commandery Zheng family. After a long journey, the remnants of the Chu army could finally stop and get enough time to breathe. An old Chu soldier picked up the sword of his dead comrade and turned to look in the direction of the Chu. With this look, he fell down and did not get up again. Such a scene was not the only one on the battlefield where the battle had ended. Many people suddenly fell to the ground after the battle, but they were all facing their homeland. They were too tired, and their bodies had surpassed their limits. When they finally reached a safe place and completed their mission to protect their comrades, they relaxed but could not continue. The granaries in the city were burning. At the final stage of the battle, the Zheng family army, knowing they could not win, burned the grain. 2 hours after the battle ended, there were ships docked at Yongfu Harbor, and large amounts of grain were transported ashore. Some of the Chu generals were shocked, speechless. They knew that the grain did not come from their own arrangements, but from a mysterious person related to the Bazin Kendo ground. But the grain came from the Chu, who had the ability to prepare so much grain in the Chu and send it here so quickly. What kind of person can make the rich in Guangzhou put their money in his hands? While the Chu generals were pondering the question of grain, Marquis Li was pondering this question. He was riding a carriage in a Heavy Cloud Town. Heavy Cloud Town was one of the few ancient towns in the Qin dynasty. It was located on the Wu mountain side of the border between Qin and Chu. It was very close to the battlefield, but because the roads were too difficult to pass through, it avoided all the wars that happened in history. The reason why Heavy Cloud Town became one of the gathering places for caravans was because the roads were difficult to travel through. There were many hunters and herdsmen in the mountainous areas where the roads were difficult to traverse. The population in these areas was sparse, but they were rich in production. Ordinary goods such as rice, tea, and so on could be transported to these areas by manpower. They could be exchanged for astonishingly valuable furs, elixirs, and so on. The road was difficult to travel on, so they could only rely on their feet or horses. The travel time was very long, so they had to prepare a lot of supplies. There had to be a lot of caravans traveling back and forth. Many years ago, Heavy Cloud Town had become lively like this. But the area around Heavy Cloud Town was still barren. The ordinary goods that the caravans transported could not attract the attention of the court. Also, while they could earn hundreds of times the profit, they did not have much to trade for, and the court did not consider it. The core of Guangzhou was far from Heavy Cloud Town. No one would connect the wealth of Guangzhou to such a remote place. But who would have thought that the mysterious person who managed most of the wealth for the wealthy families of Guangzhou, third young Master Guan, lived in a place like this? Wealth was often associated with good wine, mansions, beautiful women, and a luxurious life. But other than the savagery of the caravans, what else did this place have? What is in this place that is worth you staying here for so long? So when the carriage stopped in front of an ordinary stilted building, Marquis Li walked out of the carriage and into the stilted building. When he saw the two people in front of him, he could not help but ask such a question. In front of him was a middle-aged man and an old servant. The middle-aged man was calm as he made tea. There was black tea boiling in the iron kettle. The tea was dark in color, but had a unique fragrance. You know who I am? Looking at Marquis Li, this uninvited guest, the middle-aged man didn't show much surprise. He only smiled and asked in return, "I'm not asking you. I am asking him." Marquis Li smiled. His gaze landed on the old servant behind the middle-aged man. This old servant wore patched old robes. The old robes had been washed until they were white, and its former color could not be seen. Previously, he had been keeping his head slightly bowed in a humble manner. Only when Marquis Li said this did he raise his head. "How do you know it is me?" the old servant asked in return. His face was ordinary, and he seemed to have experienced many hardships and lived a hard life without any signs of being pampered. A true tiger, even if lying in the weakest position, can be recognized at a glance, Marquis Li said with a smile. The old servant was silent for a moment, and then looked at Marquis Li. Only people like this, only people who have seen many people like this can recognize the difference at a glance. Which Marquis of the Qin dynasty are you? Marquis Li was surprised. There are only so many marquises in the Qin dynasty. Since you have guessed that I am one of them, how can you not be able to tell? The old servant smiled and sighed. I have not paid attention to the affairs of the world for many years, and do not know much about the outside world. Marquis Li's gaze suddenly sharpened. If you do not know much about the outside world, then you should know your own identity. Third young Master Guan? The old servant's expression did not change. He met Marquis Li's gaze and shook his head. I can be third young Master Guan, and I can also not be third young Master Guan. At this time, the middle-aged man making tea in front of him stood up and stood behind the old man. The old man sat down, and Marquis Li sat down across from him. I do not understand the meaning of this, Marquis Li said as he took the teacup the old servant brought over. I'm just a handler. I do not control anything myself. If the client is willing, they can change anyone to be third young Master Guan at any time. The old man smiled slightly and said, You should know that any coin or banknote is a symbol without any value. Marquis Li frowned. The old man looked at him and said calmly, The wealth of the Qin dynasty is in the hands of the Guangzhou elites, so the Guangzhou elites cannot fall. You should know, even if you take all their wealth now, if they do not recognize the currency in circulation, then the currency of this dynasty will lose all value. I fear you will not be able to trade for anything in the market. You are right. There is such a possibility. Marquis Li looked calmly at him and said, But the key is that not everyone has the resolve to die together. If we can get rid of some of the key people, maybe the matter will be resolved. The old man smiled even more warmly and asked in return, Then have you ever thought that you want to use me to find some key people, but I may just be bait to lure people of your level? Chapter 756. Yes, many things in the world are transactions in the eyes of you businessmen. Marquis Li frowned and said coolly, But have you ever thought of the fundamental difference between you and us? The old man said, Please teach. Marquis Li said, The fundamental difference between you and me is that my identity and status comes from military service, from how much I have given to this dynasty. So even though we both possess great power, my power represents the will of the dynasty. Even if you defeat me, you will not be tolerated in this dynasty. There is no meaning. Hearing his confident and threatening words, the old man smiled emotionally and asked in return, "If this dynasty does not act according to the rules of the ancestors and cannot tolerate us, then why should we stay in this dynasty?" A cold wind rose in this stilted building. The boiling tea suddenly trembled along the rim of the cup and quickly turned cold. Marquis Lee's expression grew extremely cold. He knew that the other had dared to say such rebellious words because he had made some preparations and was not just bluffing. "Do you know how many people will die in Guangzhou because of your words?" He looked at the old man and asked coldly, "Some people cannot leave as they wish. When an old tree moves, even its roots will rot." The old man's expression did not change much, and he still spoke in a tone as though he was chatting with a guest. "Your words are reasonable, but at the same time, if you stretch your hand too far, it is easy to be cut off." When all the cultivation places in Chongling were under the jurisdiction of the imperial trainers, us businessmen knew that it was only a matter of time before it was our turn. If fighting for our own interests is a business, then Marquis Lee, you are a bargaining chip with enough weight. Marquis Lee slowly put down the teacup. Since they could not talk, there was no need to talk. But he was still curious about some things. He repeated the question he had asked when he first arrived. "What benefits did the people of Guangzhou give you that you are willing to stay in a place like this despite your great wealth?" Things have changed in the past, but many memories remain. There are many beautiful places in the world, but there are very few places that make people think of them. The old man looked at Marquis Lee and said seriously and emotionally, "When I was your age, I also wanted to go to the farthest places. But after a few years, I like to stay in places that make you think of beautiful things. For me to stay here, it's naturally because there was someone here that I truly liked." In the end, the old man looked at Marquis Lee and solemnly admonished, "There is no wealth in this world that is more important than a person." Marquis Lee did not speak. He stood up and walked to the window of this stilted building. Like the owner of this place, he opened the window that opened outwards. He was more and more certain that the other party had already made preparations. It was even like what young Master Guan said. This was probably a deliberate flaw, a trap prepared for him. However, he was, after all, a general who had fought countless battles. Even if the other party was a strong enemy, he could not easily retreat. Most importantly, he needed to at least know what kind of power stood behind the other party. Even if he was defeated this time, he had to see the true face of his opponent. When the window was opened, the wind blew against the window frame, making creaking sounds. In a flash, the wormwood on the roof of this stilted building started to sway. In the mountains and forests around Heavy Cloud Town that were not suitable for armies to travel through, sharp sounds suddenly sounded. Large patches of forest were torn apart by the wind. Many battles started at the same time. Disbelief flashed through Marquis Lee's eyes. This time, in order to force this mysterious young Master Guan to submit, he had brought all of his elite troops. Compared to when he went to Chongling to surround Min Mountain Sword Sect, these elite troops had only abandoned some large seal weapons and some unnecessary supplies. But no matter how light they were, an army was still an army. Also, he was leading a border army that was familiar with this kind of wild land. They were equipped with large amounts of light but powerful seal weapons. No small group of cultivators could fight against an army of this level. Even the former Min Mountain Sword Sect could not fight against the army led by him and the other two marquises. When the number of elite troops exceeded a certain limit, only an equal number of elite troops could fight against them, and they had to have large amounts of good military equipment. Right now, in the entire Qin and Chu border area, there was no elite army that could fight against his personal army. The Qin elite troops were deep in the Chu borders, and most of the Chu dynasty's elite troops had died. The rest had retreated to Jiaodong Commandery and Wuji. Yet, the scale and intensity of the fighting that started in all directions was clearly a fight between elite troops of the same level. Who was it that possessed such a well-equipped elite army that could even contend against his personal army? Even more importantly, both he and Zheng Xiu had not found any signs that the Guangzhou elites had such an army. "You've really surprised me." He looked at the wind and rain around him and said slowly without turning back, Is there any meaning in continuing? It is not good for anyone, the old man warned sincerely. Chu weapons, most of them are Chu people. Marquis Li frowned deeply. He looked at the chaotic splendor in the forest and sensed some of the auras within. A strong killing intent appeared in the depths of his eyes. Then, he coldly said, "The meaning now is whether you can keep me here or not. Just like what you said before, only by keeping me here will you have enough bargaining chips. Otherwise, you will still suffer a crushing defeat." The moment he finished speaking, an extremely majestic aura surged around him. This aura directly tore the turret into pieces. Countless pieces wrapped around him and spun around him, forming a hurricane. In the hurricane, the middle-aged man who had been standing quietly behind the old man slowly retreated in the air. Primordial chi gushed out from his body to protect the old man. Marquis Li's eyes narrowed slightly. Previously, he had felt that this old man and the middle-aged man were not Realm 7 cultivators. But now, under the pressure of his energy, this seemingly ordinary middle-aged man showed greatness. Under the clash of their vital essences, they were actually evenly matched. It was clear that the other had walked very far on the path of Realm 7. But even now, he still did not feel he would lose. An enormous roar sounded in the sky again. Two mountainous balls of energy quickly flew over. He had many Realm 7s under his command, and only Realm 7s could stop Realm 7s from leaving. He did not believe the other had more and more powerful Realm 7 Grandmasters than him. Chapter 757. You are not a match for me. Marquis Li looked at the middle-aged man protecting third young Master Guan and said slowly with narrowed eyes. Even though the other's vital energy cultivation was close to his, he still had absolute confidence when their presences clashed. The middle-aged man's face paled slightly. He bowed slightly to show his retreat. At the same time, he said in a tone that was neither servile nor overbearing, "Your opponent is not me." Grandmasters could sense each other. Just from the other's presence and some minor actions, he understood that the other only had one mission in this battle: to protect third young Master Guan and leave. Such a powerful Grandmaster was only used to protect third young Master Guan. Then who was his true opponent? Marquis Li did not look at the middle-aged man. He took a deep breath and turned around. The two powerful energies that belonged to him had entered the town. Like enormous pythons passing through, all the buildings in Heavy Cloud Town that were in front of the two Grandmasters were destroyed. At this time, he heard a guqin sound. This sound was clear and moving, like the distant mountains and rivers, and came softly. Yet when the sound came, the primal energies of the universe above Heavy Cloud Town suddenly changed. Countless primal energies twisted together, forming multiple beams of light that fell towards one of the Grandmasters under him. Tong Qin. Marquis Li's expression changed, and he shouted angrily, "You are colluding with the Chu." The power that came with the guqin sound was extremely strong, and a large part of the power came from the seal weapon itself, from the Tong Qin that produced the sound. The master of the Tong Qin was a Grandmaster from Tong Mountain in the Chu. This Grandmaster was a true Chu person and was loyal to the Chu dynasty. This was the reason for his fury. No matter what methods the Guanzhong used against him, he would not care. But colluding with other dynasties was something he could not tolerate. No one responded to him. The middle-aged man protecting third young Master Guan retreated resolutely. His methods were unique. His and third young Master Guan's figures quickly faded in a patch of gray mist. That patch of gray mist seemed to be the methods of the Qi cultivators who cultivated the Yin and Ghost method, but was filled with sword energy. It was a kind of sword formula. A new figure appeared in front of the gray mist like a shield, and attracted all of his attention, including his anger and murderousness. This was also a middle-aged man, but he looked more ordinary than the previous middle-aged man. Moreover, the clothes he wore made him look like a servant. But in front of his anger and murderousness, this person was as calm as a rock. His presence did not ripple. Based on this point alone, this guru was much more powerful than the guru who had protected the third child of the Guan family and retreated. Grandmasters could sense each other. As their auras surged, Marquis Li had already sensed the other's powerful life bond sword essence. He looked at this grandmaster and said in a harsh voice, "You are from the Qin?" "I am from the Qin." This grandmaster's words and actions were still like a servant, but under the pressure of Marquis Li's presence and murderousness, he was calm and did not fall behind. He nodded to Marquis Li in greeting. "This one is Wu Guang, please teach me." "Teach what? Since you are from the Qin, you should be killed for colluding with the Chu." Marquis Li sneered. The moment he opened his mouth to say the first word, his killing intent had already spilled out to its fullest. Two terrifying presences appeared in front of him at the same time. One came from the depths of his energy, with a strong life bond presence. Clearly, it was his life bond item. The other presence came from outside his body. It should have been a seal weapon, but this presence was so strong, it was not any weaker than his life bond presence. The moment these two powerful auras appeared in front of him, they strangely blended together. The mysterious energy from the outside and the life bond energy coming out of his body intertwined with dazzling light. These lights formed two enormous iron wings in front of him. These two metal wings were like the wings of a powerful beast filled with vital energy, but they were stronger than any beast's wings in the world. Along the tips of these two metal wings, there was a string of explosions. Crystal patterns spread out in the air like spiderwebs. Wu Guang looked up. Both the movement of his head and the movement of his sword seemed very slow, but his jaw and right hand created a series of trajectories in the air. As though he was purposefully responding to Marquis Li's sword essence, an enormous golden light appeared in Wu Guang's hand. This golden light flashed with energy like a golden wing that covered the world. Swan's sword. Marquis Li's expression changed completely, not because of terror, but because of increasing anger. He had left a family general in Chongling to guard, but several months ago, that family general had died at the hands of a mysterious swordsman. That swordsman was the heir to the swan sword. There was a muffled boom. The world seemed to shake. A ring of light spread out from between Marquis Li and Wu Guang. Wherever the ring of light passed, there were terrifying explosions. Even the hardest mountain rock was blown to powder. But Marquis Li and Wu Guang's bodies did not move at this moment. Their bodies were locked together under the pressure of the energy. The swords in their hands showed their true appearance at this time. The life bond item in Marquis Li's hand was an iron-gray spear, but the one that flew out from his left sleeve was an iron-gray short sword. From the almost identical patterns and aura of the spear and the sword, the two should be made of the same material and made by the same master craftsman. This short sword and the long spear in his hand were embedded together at the tip of the spear, forming a strange spear blade. This spear blade was currently locked onto the golden swan sword in Wu Guang's hand. The two terrifying forces were grinding against each other, shooting out streaks of lightning-like light. In this moment of fighting, Marquis Li clearly had the upper hand using the power of the sword in his hand. He pressed Wu Guang's body down. The ground under Wu Guang's feet did not cave in, but exploded layer by layer, sending out dust. Marquis Li maintained this posture. Behind him, a hole was suddenly smashed open in the chaotic smoke and dust, and a general in dark armor smashed down like a meteor. This was his deputy general, and also the strongest cultivator under his command, Xiao Lai. When the Tung Qin master appeared, the two grandmasters under him instantly made their choice. Chun Yeshuan, whose combat strength was slightly inferior to Xiao Lai's, went to intercept the Tung Qin master, while Xiao Lai rushed over in an instant. Marquis Li had never thought that this would be a fair battle. When he found out that someone was using young Master Guan to set up a trap and wanted to use him as a bargaining chip with Zheng Xiu, this battle became a war for him. Especially after Grandmaster Chu appeared, all he wanted to do was to kill every opponent that appeared. Xiao Lai had followed Marquis Li since he was just a Realm 4 cultivator. The two had great teamwork, but almost no one in the outside world knew that he and Marquis Li had such a method of one person locking down and one person attacking. Because all the enemies that had faced them before had been killed by them. The two of them had used this method to kill cultivators stronger than them on the battlefield more than once. Right now, Wu Guang was at most equal to Marquis Li. So when Xiao Lai attacked Wu Guang, in his eyes, Wu Guang was a dead man. But in this moment, he saw a young figure appear on Wu Guang's left. His pupils contracted violently, and he looked as if he had seen a ghost. Chapter 758. Purely in terms of power, even if a Realm 8 cultivator suddenly appeared, a Grandmaster like Xiao Lai would not be so shocked. Because a Realm 7 Grandmaster like him, even if he had no chance of victory against a Realm 8 existence, he would at least have a chance to escape. Especially when Xiao Lai was a cultivator in the army. A cultivator like him had experienced countless cruel battles. It was impossible for him to be stunned by the strength of his opponent. What caused him to look like he had seen a ghost was that the young person he saw was someone who had died long ago in his mind, and he was very familiar with this person. From a certain point of view, this person had once been his friend. His sword move was slightly slowed. His attack was slow, but the young cultivator who had appeared was not slow at all. In this moment, the young cultivator who made him look like he had seen a ghost gave him an even greater shock. A sword light flashed in the young cultivator's hand. The sword light landed between Marquis Li's spear and sword. At this time, Marquis Li and Wu Guang were locked in a stalemate. Their energies were connected. While they appeared unmoving, their energies were constantly colliding. The power moving between their weapons was likely greater than when they attacked alone. Yet, where the young cultivator's sword light landed, there was a crisp sound. The stalemate between Marquis Li and Wu Guang was immediately broken. The two people's bodies gave off a muffled sound. They hit the ground like pillars and then bounced backwards. The moment the two of them left the ground beneath them suddenly changed shape. Countless cracks extended deep into the ground, but there was still no mud or gravel that flew up. Every strand of origin chi under their feet seemed to have turned into extremely sharp sword intents. They only condensed and pierced downwards, but did not explode. Marquis Li looked at the young cultivator who suddenly appeared. His expression grew even more spectacular, so complicated that it could not be described with words. Because this young cultivator was his son, Li Shixing. Xiao Lai stopped. This was actually the best time for him to attack. But he saw Marquis Li's back tremble violently as he flew back. This was a trembling that came from the depths of his energy sea. Only when the mind was shaken to the extreme would a cultivator like Marquis Li feel like his body was about to split apart and die. He had to ensure that Marquis Li would not have a fatal problem. Also, this sudden appearance of Li Shixing made him unable to distinguish between friend and foe. He held his black life-bond sword with one hand and kept his guard up. His left hand pressed on Marquis Li's back. An extremely gentle energy wrapped around Marquis Li's body, allowing his feet to land on the ground. The chaotic impact was directed to the ground by his vital energy, but this time it caused the earth and rocks on the ground to explode. Marquis Li's expression quickly calmed, but when he looked at Li Shixing, who had landed not far from Wu Guang, his gaze seemed to be distant. "I thought you were dead." "You can pretend that I'm already dead." Li Shixing looked at him like he was looking at an ordinary passerby, or rather, an ordinary general he had seen several times in the past. For some reason, hearing the two's conversation, even Xiao Lai felt pain in his heart. Marquis Li's heart did not hurt, but inexplicably cold. He raised an eyebrow. In his view, the son he was so familiar with was quickly becoming unfamiliar, so unfamiliar that he did not seem to recognize him. He looked at Li Shixing and slowly said, "If you had let me know you were still alive, I would have made many different choices." Li Shixing looked at his starry eyes, and his expression grew determined. He asked seriously, "You left me alive? And then?" "To make you stronger." Marquis Li took a deep breath and said, "You have already become very strong. I really did not become very strong because of you." Li Shixing shook his head. "The truth is, because of your compromise, I have come close to death many times." Marquis Li grew angry. He looked at Li Shixing and said harshly, Do you think you can survive on the Wuji border until now just by yourself? I know you sent many subordinates to take care of me in secret, but in the end, you still think I am dead." Li Shixing looked at him and said calmly, "I thought you would think I would be different after I died, but in the end, you're still constantly accepting benefits and compromising." Marquis Li was silent for a long time. Then he slowly raised his left hand. His left hand was holding a strange short sword. There were many sunflower-like patterns on the short sword. "This sword belongs to your third Uncle Huai, but he died to block a blow for me." Then he turned his head and looked at Xiao Lai, who was behind him. "Your uncle Xiao Lai also blocked 2 sword strikes for me, but he was lucky enough to survive. You should understand that all my fame and glory came from the piles of corpses of many people. Among these corpses, there were not only enemies. I can't implicate all of them just because you're alone. You have your reasons." Li Shixing bowed his head slightly and said slowly, "But in these years, I only lived according to your thoughts. Your compromise makes me no different from a hostage sent to another court. You cannot owe your subordinates. Then what about what you owe me? Now that I am alive, what will you change because of me?" Li Shixing's words caused Marquis Li to be silent for a long time. In this time, Xiao Lai had sent out numerous military orders. The army in the surrounding forest retreated, and the killing gradually stopped. The greatest problem here is not just the problem of father and son. Marquis Li finally spoke and said, "It is the relationship between Qin and Chu. There is no relationship between Qin and Chu." Li Shixing shook his head briskly and said, "There is no Chu now. There is only the problem between the Qin people, the relationship between Yuan Wu Xiao and the Bazinkindo ground." Such direct words caused Xia Lai's breathing to stop and his face to pale. Marquis Li's pupils contracted violently again. "Your sword comes from Donghu, has been tempered by celestial fire, and received the life bond energy of the ascetic monks." Marquis Li did not respond to Li Shixing's words. His gaze landed on the yellow crystal sword in Li Shixing's hand. He asked, "So that day, when Donghu was shaken and the mountain where the ascetic monks gathered had a breakthrough to Realm 7, that person was you?" Li Shixing nodded in silent agreement. Marquis Li looked up at the distant mountain behind Li Shixing's head. His expression recovered, and he said coolly, "I want to see what step you have reached." Li Shixing's eyebrows rose. He looked at his calm and powerful father, slowly raised his sword, and held it across his chest. Chapter 759. Other than the relationship between father and son, in terms of cultivation, Li Shixing was definitely a junior to Marquis Li. But seeing Li Shixing raise his sword to his chest, Marquis Li did not give way. He even took the initiative to attack. A strange life force aura vibrated from the long spear in his hand. The dense silver-gray yuan qi around the spear body constantly vibrated, condensed, and changed. It was like 10 flowers being cast in the air. However, the spear in his hand was like melted sugar water. It melted from his hand, turning into a strange flowing water that covered his body. The flowing water immediately froze, giving off a heart-shaking metallic light. A set of gray armor appeared on his body. The armor was thin, but the seal scripts on the surface of the armor were as dense as flowers. The seal scripts crackled between them. Both the energy coming out of his body and the primal energies of the universe gathering from the surroundings gathered between these seal scripts and turned into yellow flows of energy that flowed through the armor. The aura of these yellow streams of air made this armor give off an unbreakable feeling of heaviness and sturdiness, just like an incomparably heavy mountain. The spear turned into armor, but the short sword was still in his hand. Marquis Li held this short sword. This short sword seemed to be connected to an enormous mountain. Most people knew that Marquis Li's cultivation and combat power were above average among the marquises of the Qin dynasty. But no one knew that his greatest strength was not offense, but defense. A commander of an army could only ensure that he did not die and fall, so that his army would not be leaderless. His life bond item was the army breaking spear in the form of a spear, and the army stabilizing armor in the form of armor. After many years of nourishment from his life bond energy, this armor likely became the strongest armor in the world. Nobody knew a son better than his father. Similarly, nobody knew a father better than his son. Li Shixing had been exiled from Chongling in his youth, and had followed Marquis Li to fight on the border for a long time. He naturally knew the power of his father's life bond item. But at this time, he also knew what the other wanted to prove. So he did not hesitate and smashed the crystal sword in his hand towards Marquis Li. There was no finesse to his sword, and it even seemed crude and barbaric. What he was holding did not seem like a sword, but more like a giant hammer. In front of his crystal sword was the short sword in Marquis Li's hand. When the two swords met, it was not the crisp sound of metal blades clashing. Instead, there was a loud boom. A ball of fire exploded between the two swords. Countless strands of yellow energy shot out from the seal scripts on Marquis Li's armor, like countless yellow pythons madly attacking. Marquis Li was still standing in the same spot, the ground beneath his feet churning like boiling porridge. Li Shixing's figure was sent flying backwards. Marquis Li's gaze grew calmer, but when he saw Li Shixing's figure being sent flying, the shock in his eyes grew. Li Shixing still held his crystal sword tightly. Under such a strong blow, even he had to rely on the absorption of his life bond armor to ensure his bones were not shattered. But Li Shixing's body, in his perception, could be described as perfect, and there were no serious wounds. In his knowledge, in the world of Donghu's ascetic monks, only that old monk who had once been to Chongling and killed his way into the Donghu imperial palace had such a powerful body-tempering secret art. So the result was clear. That day, in the holy mountain where the Donghu ascetic monks had gathered, Li Shixing had not just experienced the tempering of celestial fire, or the energy baptism of many ascetic monks when he had his breakthrough. He had even received the old monk's legacy, and received an unimaginable blessing. Marquis Li knew that the old monk had been the leader of the Donghu ascetic monks before killing the Donghu emperor. So from a certain point of view, after Li Shixing's breakthrough that night, he had become the new leader of the Donghu ascetic monks. As Marquis Li thought this, the aura on his body began to change again. His gaze turned from calm to sharp, and then to indifferent. Indifference meant that he did not care, and did not even care about himself. This was a terrifying emotion. Divine might! He opened his mouth, and indifferently spat out the two words. As the sound vibrated, hundreds of visible white energy lines appeared in front of him. These were the paths through which primal energies of the universe flowed. The sound followed the law. In the world of cultivators, this was called a secret art. The law was the natural reaction of the world. The white threads of energy immediately disappeared in front of him. But the primal energies of the universe in the surroundings flowed through these tunnels like a river that had broken through a dam. His short sword stabbed towards Li Shixing in front of him. The primal energies of the universe gathered at the tip of his sword, and then exploded forward along with his sword essence. A terrifying rainbow light stretched along the tip of his sword in the air. This terrifying rainbow light was multiple times larger than his and Li Shixing's bodies. The blinding light drowned him and Li Shixing. In this rainbow light, there seemed to be countless shredded spirits screaming. There were even more spirits struggling, but they could not break free. This sword was divine might. Marquis Li had many secret arts, but this sword was his strongest. In the blinding light, Xiao Lai's expression was bleak. He had watched Li Shixing grow up and was no different from Li Shixing's uncle. He could not understand why Marquis Li would use such a sword. Even though he had seen Li Shixing's previous moves, he had no confidence that Li Shixing could withstand this attack. At this moment, he seemed to hear the same voice in the air. Divine might! Li Shixing's feet were still rubbing on the ground. He had not steadied himself, and his body was still sliding backwards. Yet his body was in a perfect posture for a sword attack. Faced with this destructive rainbow light, he did not hesitate at all and unleashed the same sword strike. His hand was extremely steady. Destructive light charged out of his sword tip and hit the incoming rainbow light at a speed that even a Realm 7 cultivator's perception could not keep up. The two rainbow lights hit each other, and tangible light sprayed in all directions. Every stream of light caused a shocking explosion. Many ancient buildings in the heavy cloud town, which had been standing in this town for hundreds of years, were shattered into pieces after being hit by a tiny drop of the light liquid. When the two rainbow lights were still attacking, Marquis Lee had put his sword away. The power of this sword attack was purely to push the primal energies of the universe forward. After the sword essence was released, it had nothing to do with him. He looked at the beautiful and dangerous light scattering, and his eyes were filled with emotion and sorrow. This terrifying clash only lasted for a short breath. When he looked up again, Li Shixing's figure had appeared in the dust in front of him. He frowned. The armor on his body slid off like water and then gathered in his hand, turning back into a spear. But he did not attack again. "For you?" Then his hand moved slightly. The spear flew from his hand and landed in front of Li Shixing. Chapter 760. Li Shixing was stunned. Even though the vital energy of the spear had caused all the hair on his body to stand on end, he still did not understand what his father was trying to do. Marquis Li's viciousness had disappeared from his face, leaving only faint loneliness. He looked at the dazed Li Shixing and said, "Since you have made up your mind and can withstand my attack, I will do as you wish. This item has no use in my hands, so I will pass it to you." Li Shixing looked at him and did not respond. He did not take the spear. He wanted to hear Marquis Li's next words. "You say that you want to join the Bazinkindo ground because you have a life and death relationship with that person, the wine shop youth. But you should know that I stood on Yuan Wu's side decades ago. Many of my brothers died in battle against the Bazinkindo ground." Marquis Li glanced at him and said coolly, "If I join the Bazinkindo ground, how can I face their friendship? Starting today, all I can do is not help either side." Hearing this, Xiao Lai, who was not far behind him, could not control his emotions. Even his hands started to tremble, but his expression grew calmer. He said without stopping, "Starting today, I will give up my position as Marquis and become an idle person." Li Shixing's lips started to tremble slightly. This was not the best result he wanted, nor was it one of the results he could think of. But this was a result he could understand and accept. "All right." He gritted his teeth and replied with a simple word. "Driving you out of Chongling is not completely because of compromise, but because I am in the border army. You will be safer with me looking after you. Also, a wolf raised in a wolf's den is at least stronger than a dog raised in a warm house in Chongling." Marquis Li's gaze suddenly warmed. "In that case, you should understand why I had to use the sword at the end." Li Shixing pressed his lips together and did not speak. Marquis Li did not speak to him anymore. Instead, he turned around and bowed seriously to Xiao Lai, whose mind was still in turmoil. He said, "I am not a saint and cannot do things thoroughly. After thinking about it, I can only do this." Xiao Lai wanted to say something, but he couldn't. His qi and blood surged up, and his face turned red. After a few breaths, he sighed and bowed in return. "I've worked hard for half my life, and I'm willing to let it go like this. Not many people can compare to me in such a carefree manner." He had gone through fire and water with Marquis Li, so he was very familiar with Marquis Li's personality. He knew that once Marquis Li had made a decision, he would not change it. While he understood that Marquis Li's casual passing of the Marquis position meant that he and the other generals would have to clean up the mess in the future, he didn't say anything when he left in the end. He used Third Young Master Guan to lure me into a trap, but in the end, he just wanted us father and son to meet. This should be Lin Zhuzhou's plan? Xiao Lai left. The forest was even quieter. Marquis Li stood among the ruins and put away his sword. He looked at Li Shixing with his hands behind his back and said, "But as a member of the Li Marquis establishment, in the future, you have to take care of my subordinates for me." Li Shixing took a deep breath and nodded in agreement. "From now on, I will travel the world and not care about these conflicts. Be careful. I do not want to hear news of your death again." After saying this, Marquis Li let out an extremely rare smile. His body also seemed to have put down 1,000 kilograms of burden and even had an inexplicable feeling of lightness. Seeing his father turn to leave, Li Shixing's last thread of resentment towards him dissipated. He couldn't help but ask, "Where can I find you in the future? There are too many places I want to go, and my whereabouts are uncertain." Marquis Li's hair was loose. Once he was no longer the commander of the army, he felt inexplicably carefree. He did not turn his head and said softly, "The Bazinkindo ground has taken Jiaodong Commandery and has Guanzhong's help. I fear that this battle will be decided in a few years. When everything is settled, I will naturally come find you." Li Shixing felt inexplicably sour. He wanted to speak, but Marquis Li's figure disappeared into the forest. But he seemed to think of an important matter. A light voice passed into Li Shixing's ears. "Zheng Xiao has built 3 workshops in Guangzhou. She says she wants to control the lifeblood of the rich in Guangzhou. But fighting for wealth with those merchants is not something someone like her would do. So there must be a secret. Have the Bazinkindo ground pay attention." The voice came with the wind, growing lower and lower until it disappeared completely. Li Shixing had not cried since he left Chongling. At this time, he had reached Realm 7, but when the voice disappeared, his nose felt sore and he felt like crying. "I did not expect this." Xie Chongqing sat in the center of a treehouse and could not help but shake his head. Wu Guang was his close attendant. Since Wu Guang had come here, it meant that he, the invisible powerhouse, was also here. The treehouse he was in was actually at the edge of Heavy Cloud Town, built on an old pine tree. The branches and leaves of this old pine tree had been mostly broken by the wild energy storm from the previous battle. But in this relatively intact treehouse where one could see all of Heavy Cloud Town, Xie Chongqing's conduct would make anyone speechless. There was a charcoal basin in front of him. There was a golden pot on top of the charcoal basin. The soup in the golden pot was boiling. Fresh wild mushrooms from the nearby forest and fish from afar were placed on both sides of the pot. These fish had been cleaned and sliced by the chefs. They could be eaten after being boiled in the pot. What kept the fish fresh was the cold jade boxes that some cultivation places use to preserve spirit medicines. In Heavy Cloud Town not far from him, dozens of breaths ago, there were many powerful cultivators fighting to the death, but he was leaning on the couch and enjoying himself. I had not expected Marquis Li to be so willing and so carefree. I had not expected Li Shixing to be so strong now. He put a few pieces of matsutake into the pot and could not help but sigh. Then he said to Wu Guang, who was standing behind him, "But Li Shixing's actions have given me an interesting idea." "What?" Wu Guang glanced at him, who was putting on an act. After following Xie Chongqing for a long time, he knew that the interesting ideas Xie Chongqing spoke of were truly interesting. Other people would not be able to think of them even if they cracked their heads. This was because no one would squander as unscrupulously as Xie Chongqing and do things that did not make sense. Everyone says I am a prodigal, but am I the greatest prodigal? I have not spent all the money Ding Ning gave me, but she left a private treasury in Jiaodong Commandery that Jiaodong Commandery accumulated over hundreds of years for Ding Ning. Xie Chongqing sighed sorrowfully, as if he was groaning for no reason. How are we going to spend all those things? The ascetic cultivators on the Donghu border are interesting. Their methods are good, and they are strong against enemies. They usually cultivate their bodies and lack the spirit medicines in the sea to strengthen their energies. Jiaodong Commandery has a lot of those things this time. I want to see what will happen if I throw a large pile of things to those ascetic cultivators. Chapter 761. Xie Chongqing enjoyed himself, but Wu Guang was silent. The kingdoms outside the pass like Donghu and Wuji had always been poor. In the early years, not to mention the resources needed for cultivation, even the metal on the arrowheads needed the gifts of the dynasties of the Central Plains. The countries formed by these nomads had to pay a great price in order to trade for some scarce resources from some permitted border trade. Also, these exchanges were often not of equal value. Simply speaking, no matter how the dynasties of the Central Plains changed, none of them wanted to become stronger than the countries outside the pass. So in history, the cultivators of these wild kingdoms outside the Yin Mountain relied on celestial iron and celestial jade marrow. Celestial iron was meteoric iron. Some meteoric iron, when falling, would burn with the primal energies of the universe to form a unique and dense structure. It brought with it unique power and created some of the legendary weapons of Donghu and Wuji. Celestial jade marrow was actually the densest part of some ordinary agate stone left behind after countless years of weathering. Some of the jade marrow was extremely hard and could be used as armor-piercing arrowheads and spears. Some could strangely merge with the primal energies of the universe and be used to create seal weapons. For thousands of years, many ascetic cultivators chose to cultivate on foot in desolate and uninhabited areas, not just to temper their resolve in flesh, but also because in these kingdoms, many of the raw materials for powerful seal weapons were created during cultivation. This was an exploration of the barren land inch by inch. The ascetic cultivators of Donghu mostly had a few seal weapons on them. They did not look poor, but in reality, these were the inheritances of many generations of cultivators. They were not like some of the cultivation places with long histories in Chongling. Many cultivators who came out of the mountains only had a few treasures, but the mountains had mountains of swords. Those ascetic cultivators could be said to have put all their belongings on their bodies. When their time was up, they would find suitable heirs and pass down these things. If their disciples were lucky, the next generation of disciples would have one or two more items. If they were unlucky, maybe the things they passed down would be destroyed or lost in battle. It was precisely such a barren cultivation environment that created the unique cultivation methods of these ascetic cultivators. They did not pursue worldly treasures that contained large amounts of spirit energy. Instead, they worked on the mind. Their secret methods mostly increased their perception. Some experts' mental power was almost tangible. This way, they could sense further than ordinary cultivators and extract as much energy from the thin primal energies of the universe that was useful to them. If it was a joke, their strong perception would give them the opportunity to pick up more cultivation materials. The powerful cultivators were reduced to scavengers. This was indeed the helplessness of the Central Plains dynasties working together to exploit them. The countries supported by these ascetic monks with extraordinary willpower could resist the invasion of the Central Plains dynasties. In the long river of history, they would even occasionally have the chance to invade the Central Plains and plunder. This was enough to make people feel admiration for these ascetic monks. Wu Guang was silent, but his heart felt numb. No one in history had ever done what Xie Changxing said, because no noble with astonishing resources would want to feed a group of ascetics who were used to being hungry. No noble with astounding cultivation resources would be as wasteful and mischievous as Xie Changxing. No one would even think of doing this. But if they really did this, what kind of change would it bring? Wu Guang found it hard to imagine. Jiaodong Commandery was made from overseas. Countless treasures were astounding cultivation resources for the Central Plains dynasties, and for the Donghu cultivation world, who were extremely frugal. Some things that were just decorations in the Central Plains dynasties were used to the extreme and were great cultivation resources in their eyes. For example, some red corals, some shells from the deep sea, some seahorses that were old enough, pearls, and so on. These were things that were common in the wealthy families of Jiaodong Commandery, and were even treasures in Donghu. They were not even enough to support cultivation. Many herders used their life savings to trade for them, and then offered them to these ascetic cultivators. These ascetic cultivators' repayment was to help them get rid of their illnesses, chase away the wild beasts in the plains, and protect their safety. Some people had the potential to cultivate, but could not cultivate because of the limitations of these resources. If Xie Changxing generously placed these things in front of them, this most famous prodigal of Guanzhong would most likely become a living Buddha in the mouths of many people in the wilderness behind Yin Mountain. It is interesting just thinking about it. Looking at Wu Guang, who was silent on the outside, but had great thoughts on the inside, Xie Changxing felt slightly intoxicated and admired that his ideas were unique in the world. Should we let her take advantage of the situation? Wu Guang thought for a moment and asked. He knew that Xie Changxing was different from many people in that he would do what he said and not just talk. After the change of Min Mountain Sword Sect in Chongling, all cultivators paid the most attention to the traces of Yi Siling, Bailey Sushue, and the others. The Xie family naturally paid the most attention to the eldest daughter of the Xie family, Xie. But the news from several days ago was that after the change of Chongling, Xie had been arranged to go to Wuji. As to why she had been arranged to go to Wuji, Bailey Sushu must have his own considerations. Wu Guang was thinking that since the eldest daughter of the Xie family was in the area of Donghu and Wuji, and Xie Chongshen was going to do such a thing, he could let Xie borrow the power. Especially in the history of Donghu, there were many ascetic cultivators who had great prestige in the wilderness, and their status was no less than the imperial family. My sister and I are not the same kind of people. But Xie Chongshen immediately shook his head and said, I heard that when she cultivated the sword in Min Mountain Sword Sect, she was locked up by Bailey Sushue in the ice house on the highest peak. Who knows what sword essence Bailey Sushue had her cultivate? I do not want a bunch of believers to run in front of her every day to chant. Then the ice and snow she worked so hard to get out of the ice house will be broken by me. I do not want her to chase me around with a sword when we meet in the future. Wu Guang raised an eyebrow. Reasonable. The upper cold peak of Min Mountain Sword Sect. There is wind and snow outside the Great Wall. Xie Chongshen shrunk his neck and put away his smile. He sighed softly. It is cold. Send one of the best and most expensive fur robes of the Jiaodong Commandery to my sister. Wu Guang nodded. In this moment, he felt that Xie Chongshen had grown up. A youth in falling parasol has become an old demon in the blink of an eye. Ant was a beautiful couple, but in a flash, Xie Chongshen started to sing softly as he drank wine. He sighed. Pity that my sister had to give up before she married. Otherwise, she would be the best prodigal in the world and the best swordsman in the world as her brother-in-law. This would be so impressive. Chapter 762. Everyone had different opinions on what was called awe-inspiring. Some people wanted to be the best in the world. Some only wanted to do a few things others could not do. Some only needed a satisfied praise from their wives. Those who were content were happy. After Yin Mountain, there were very few spring days. Most of the time, it was winter with flying snow and dripping water into ice. But the Wuji people had their own ways of survival. In many valleys, there were many winter pastures. Some pastures had very special microclimates. When it was snowing outside, it was as warm as spring due to the geothermal heat underground, and the vegetation was lush. In some winter pastures, there were some cold-resistant plants that grew tenaciously under the snow. These plants grew very slowly, but they provided more nutrients than ordinary grasses. In many of Wuji's winter pastures, there were large amounts of cold land maca growing in the frozen soil of some pastures. This unique tuber could greatly increase the resistance of animals to the cold, give animals a unique feeling of fullness, and even greatly stimulate reproduction. At certain times, the Wuji people would drive large numbers of animals to these pastures. The reproduction speed of the animals and the hunting of the hunters determined the source of food, and also the population of Wuji. The population of Wuji was pitifully small compared to the dynasties of the Central Plains. Almost every adult male of Wuji was a warrior. In the previous battle with the Qin dynasty, Wuji had paid a great price. They had lost less troops than the Qin dynasty, but the soldiers of the Qin dynasty were purely soldiers. In the entire dynasty, they were only responsible for war. But the Wuji warriors had many roles in the clan. At times, they were herders, hunters, and even caravans heading to colder regions. The death of one person in battle had a greater effect on Wuji. The army was not enough. When they were scattered to escort large numbers of animals to different pastures, some places were easily attacked by barbaric tribes and clans. Wuji's present situation was more difficult than at any time in the past. Yet as long as some traditions did not change, this kind of kingdom could continue to support itself. In a few days, it would be the Sandun Festival. In some of Wuji's warm pastures, a kind of beautiful flower would bloom. This flower was called the Secret Realm Flower by the Wuji people. It was one of Wuji's secret medicines and could ease the fatigue of the army. Most importantly, it could cure rheumatism. At the same time, this was the time for Wuji to stock up on dairy products. Dried cheese, yogurt products, and dried meat were food that only the Wuji army was used to, but were very reliable. The food didn't carry much weight, but it could allow a cavalry to fight in the wild for a long time. In a mountain valley where flowers bloomed, some Wuji women were harvesting these colorful flowers. They carefully walked among the flowers, trying their best to only collect flowers. They didn't step on any vegetation on the ground, even the most common moss. Behind them was a ravine that had already been harvested. There were a few snow-capped tents beside a clear stream formed by the convergence of glacial water in the valley. The edges of the tents were embroidered with the pattern of the mystic realm flower, using golden silk thread. Before such an important festival, such tents only represented the residences of the Wuji imperial family. At this time, among these snow-capped tents, there was only one old woman. In Xie Changxing's words, this old woman was truly powerful in Wuji. She was the Wuji Empress Dowager. Many years ago, she had been in charge of this large territory. Due to the problem of faith in the minds of the Wuji people, she was the person closest to the gods, or rather, the representative of the gods in most people's minds. This ravine faced the sun, and the sunlight was good. While the most colorful mystic realm flowers had been harvested, there were still many unknown flowers blooming on the two sides of the stream. Some of the flowers had unique colors not seen in the outside world. This place was almost the same as the mystic realm many people imagined. It was extremely quiet, with no animals in the surroundings. There was only a young female attendant drying some unfinished dried meat by the stream. This kind of simple work, without any poetry, was as beautiful as a painting by the best artist in the world at this time and in this situation. The slope on one side of the ravine stretched north, and not far away was the snow line. Amidst this tranquility, a few black spots appeared incongruously somewhere under the snow line. These were travelers from far away, bringing with them the dust of many snowy mountains. These travelers did not seem to have the reverence they should have for the Wuji imperial family. Their thick black leather boots trampled on the precious vegetation of the Wuji people and brought up patches of moist soil with the remnants of the vegetation under their feet. The Wuji Empress Dowager did not leave the tent. The curtain on the side, facing these travelers, was blown open by a breeze from her fingers. She had never seen these travelers, but she had seen some of their faces in some albums. While she was very old, her memory was astoundingly good. So with a glance, she recognized the identities of these travelers. These people were not guests, but in her dim yellow eyes, there was not a trace of surprise or shock. A black cloud floated over and covered this ravine. This black cloud was very strange. It didn't just cover the sun, it stopped above the ravine as though it was alive. These travelers approached the few snow-capped tents. Long before they got close, these people had already sensed her presence, so their faces were all filled with gratification. At the same time, these travelers were very wary. When they were dozens of feet away, one of the travelers even released a flying sword, wanting to completely cut apart the tent the Wuji Empress Dowager was in. When the sword light flashed, the Wuji Empress Dowager sighed softly. She walked out of the tent. The sword light stopped as she moved. The shadow of the black cloud fell on her. Everyone could clearly see her expression. She felt some heartache for this brand new tent, but did not panic. The leading traveler immediately felt uneasy and frowned. Marquis Duanmu? She looked at the leading traveler and asked seriously, "Didn't you get your spine broken by Bailey Sushue and Min Mountain Sword Sect? How did you heal so quickly?" Her tone was sincere, but the other could not endure such a question. Anger rose in his eyes. Is it because of Zheng Xiu's spirit lotus seed? Seeing the other had no desire to answer, she guessed the answer to the question of being a seeker. Her guess was not very wrong. These travelers from afar grew solemn. Even Marquis Duanmu, whose eyes were burning with anger, narrowed his eyes slightly. A marquis naturally had a marquis presence. As his eyes narrowed, his anger disappeared, and there was only coldness like a distant mountain. Shouldn't you be more concerned about the reason why we're here in front of you to obtain something? Chapter 763. Compared to my own life, What you want to obtain is not important. The Wuji Empress Dowager smiled. Theoretically, I should care more about my life. She laughed, but Marquis Duanmu did not find it funny. No matter how he looked at it, the other did not seem to be worried about his own safety. His gaze subconsciously turned to the maidservant by the stream in the distance. The attendant had a round face and was very young. From a distance, she did not seem special and could not be a Realm 7 Grandmaster. At this time, she was looking up but did not seem to know what was happening and did not dare to come close. An attendant like this, even if she cultivated a secret art of the Wuji imperial family, clearly could not guarantee the safety of this old woman. Then, other than this attendant, what other possibility was there? The nearest Wuji army could not arrive before they took this old woman away. Yet, the more this old woman did not worry about her own life, the more it appeared to them that she had been waiting for their arrival. You knew we were coming? Marquis Duanmu frowned at the old woman, and his eyes moved. Those familiar with him knew that this was Marquis Duanmu's habit. In the military, his expression did not change, but when his eyes moved, he would kill. But now, his eyes moved because of nervousness and unease. When his voice rang out in this valley that seemed like a secret realm, he suddenly realized that he was very different from before. After Min Mountain Sword Sect was seriously wounded, while he quickly recovered with Zheng Xiu's spirit medicines, the spine was the most important dragon for cultivators. It was where the energies connected. Even if the spine was broken into multiple pieces and recovered, there would still be some hidden injuries that would hinder his future cultivation. However, this defeat affected his state of mind the most. He and the two ministers had worked together to kill Bailey Sushua. Bailey Sushua had seriously wounded the two of them, and the other had escaped into the Chongling Imperial Palace. This kind of experience was a great blow to his confidence. Sometimes, cultivators relied on their presence to advance. Once this presence was broken, they would start to hesitate and doubt. He felt that he was like this now. His mind had returned to many years ago when he was not strong enough in the military. If he lost something in battle, he would have to find it in battle. If he succeeded this time, he might be able to regain some of his confidence. Zheng Xiu is best at chain tactics, and frontal battle formations have always been what Ba Mountain Swordfield was good at when they were leading the army, not hers. Back then, when she and Ba Mountain Swordfield were fighting in the world, she only hid in the rear and used the Starfire sword as a surprise attack. Just like the Chu dynasty, when everyone's attention is focused on the battle on the front lines, or when they feel the battle is over, it is usually when she attacks. The Wuji Empress Dowager looked at this Qin dynasty marquis, whose eyes were still spinning, and said with a pleasant expression, "I have a feeling, but I cannot guess who she sent." As to why I had a feeling, I felt that it was not worth it for someone like her to start a war just to get one or two things from the Mountain of Ancestors and to prepare for the spring attack on the Chu. In the past many years, she was like the smartest merchant and would not do business where she would lose out. She definitely has other plans for the Wuji. As expected of the person who leads the Wuji, your guess is very accurate. Marquis Duanmu and the people around him grew more cautious. Marquis Duanmu took a deep breath, looked at the old woman, and said, "But putting aside your life and death, can you guess our true intentions in coming here?" "I would like to hear the details," the Wuji Empress Dowager replied. A person of high status was just a child learning to walk in front of someone of higher status. Also, Marquis Duanmu's presence had fallen after Min Mountain Sword Sect. She had been on the throne longer than any emperor in the world, and knew the hearts of people and how to deal with these nobles. What she had said before was enough for these nobles from Chongling to follow her footsteps. Wuji's power is actually far from Donghu's. The number of cultivators cannot even compare. The only difference is that the prestige of the Donghu imperial family cannot compare to yours. The ascetics of Donghu take up a large portion of the power. In Wuji, you are like the combination of the imperial family and the ascetics. You are thought of in Wuji as a person with divine authority, close to a god. Maybe after you die, you will be called a true god by the Wuji and be recorded in the history books. Marquis Duanmu did not hesitate. For him, The best way to not be controlled by the enemy was to do as he thought. So he quickly continued. But the person Wu Ji thought of as a person with divine authority was one of your sons, Wu Bahai. He was a cultivation genius and a rare talent to be a general. But he died young, so you reached this position. But we are certain that your son did not die of illness, but was poisoned to death. Marquis Duanmu looked at the old woman's features and sneered. If the Wuji know that you personally poison your son to death, what will happen? But the Wuji Empress Dowager's emotions did not change. She just shook her head. It appears that you all touched his corpse, but your deductions were wrong from the start. I did not need to poison to kill him, and would not have left such traces. The reason he died was because he failed to cultivate the poison body relic. The poison body relic is a forbidden method in Wuji. He brought it on himself and died in the end. I'm not the only one who knows of this. It was hidden. If you expose it now, it will not affect my rule. Marquis Duanmu's mind shook. He exchanged a look with the people around him, and felt a strong sense of loss and absurdity. This was what they relied on the most, because this concerned the stability of all of Wuji. Yet this matter was a mistake from beginning to end. The Wuji Empress Dowager laughed. Her smile was benevolent, but her eyes contained anger and murderousness. She knew that the mistress of the Chongling Imperial Palace thought she knew her secrets and had something to threaten her. Also, these Qin people had dug out the corpse of her son buried in the snowy peaks. So she decided to give these Qin people more suffering. Other than your wrong deductions, Zheng Xiao had you come here with an important mission. It should be the nine-eyed heaven pearl. She smiled as she looked at Marquis Duanmu and the cultivators around him. She said slowly, Wuji's nine-eyed heavenly pearl comes from outer space. Other than gathering the core energies of that meteor, the laws of the world have formed their own lines, containing the cultivation principles of starfire. For her, such an item holds endless possibilities. Seeing the shock in Marquis Duanmu and the others' eyes, this old woman who was full of murderous intent smiled even more. But there is a kind of secret that is only passed down from generation to generation by those who truly wield the throne. Even the people closest to me right now do not know that other than the nine-eyed heaven pearl, Wuji has something called the lightning formation armor. Chapter 764. This mountain slope was very warm under the sunlight. Yet in this old woman's smile, Marquis Duanmu's limbs were inexplicably cold. Cultivators always had an inexplicable fear of the unknown. The words lightning formation totem armor were completely foreign to them. Zheng Xiao must have promised you many things. Otherwise, you would not have gone to Min Mountain Sword Sect to fight Bailey Sushue. Especially after you were seriously injured by Bailey Sushue, you naturally feel that she should compensate you more. The Wuji Empress Dowager looked with slight disdain at the silent Marquis Duanmu and said, But who would she feel she owes? Have you ever thought that she sent you to Wuji not to compensate you, but to use you to obtain some secrets of the nine-eyed heavenly pearl? She might think that under such circumstances, I could only use the power of the nine-eyed heavenly jewel to protect myself. Then, she could use the starfire sword to fight against the power of the nine-eyed heavenly jewel and comprehend more astral yuan qi laws and logos. Pity, she will not succeed because I do not need to use the nine-eyed heavenly pearl, just the lightning formation armor. Marquis Duanmu's palms were sweating. At least he could hear that if something like the lightning formation armor really existed, then it would be a seal weapon on the same level as the legendary Wuji treasure, the nine-eyed heavenly pearl. What shocked him the most was that he felt the Wuji Empress Dowager's words were not without reason. Assuming that everything you said is true, even if you say that this lightning formation armor is able to defend against her starfire sword, how are you going to escape from our hands? But in a battle between experts, no details would be missed. Marquis Duanmu took a deep breath and narrowed his eyes at the Wuji Empress Dowager. Even if you can deal with me, who can deal with the people around me? Just your attendant? Hearing these words, the four subordinates beside him all laughed. Even though they did not have the confidence to win, and even their most important conjecture was wrong, their smiles were still a powerful weapon. Maybe they could force the other to get more useful information. Marquis Duanmu's words were not without reason. In the cultivation world, no one had ever seen the Wuji Empress Dowager fight. Even when the Wuji Emperor died and the imperial power fell into her hands, she had not personally fought. Of course, she could not be a cultivator of the Eighth Realm. Otherwise, her aura would not be so old. Even though she was a Realm 7 who had cultivated some kind of heaven-defying secret method, she had long passed the prime of a cultivator. Her energies had declined. At most, she could only deal with experts like Marquis Duanmu. Yet of the 4 people accompanying Marquis Duanmu, there were 2 Realm 7s and 2 Realm SIXs. Going deep into Wuji was an extremely dangerous matter. Marquis Duanmu could be said to have brought all his wealth. The maid by the stream was so young, even immature. Even now, she was still standing there in a daze. How could she possibly deal with these 4 cultivators? Unless she's Zhao Si or Bai Shanshui, but Zhao Si and Bai Shanshui are much older than her, and they can't be here. Amidst the laughter of his subordinates, Marquis Duanmu regained some of his sharpness and added with a cold smile. The Wuji Empress Dowager felt slightly emotional. She lamented that her opponent did not understand her well enough. Everyone in Wuji knew that she would never bluff. "I don't just have 1 maid, I have 2, she shook her head and said. When she finished speaking, a terrifying aura gushed out from her chest. This was her world. Even if the other had regained some confidence, she would still be the one to decide the battle. When this terrifying presence surged out of her chest, a pale white starfire fell from the sky. The cultivation method of Zheng Xiu's starfire sword was still unknown to the outside world, but some of her methods were known to cultivators. When a cultivator was willing to use their life bond energy to maintain one of her energy imprints, this cultivator would have a unique connection to her, just like her flying sword. She could use this cultivator to obtain some special senses. This special perception was most important in locking onto the presence. It could allow her to lock onto the presence of some enemies from thousands of miles away and kill them with the Starfire Sword. However, in many battles, her Starfire Sword had also become a special layer of protection. Just like now, that unique connection allowed her to sense the terrifying presence coming off the Wuji Empress Dowager from an unknown place. She immediately judged that this power was not something Marquis Duanmu and the Realm 7s next to him could match. At the same time, Marquis Duanmu and the 4 cultivators next to him paled from this presence. The 5 of them became 5 rays of light that retreated backwards. 5 waves of energy roiled in front of them. A piece of golden human-shaped celestial metal flew out of the Wuji Empress Dowager's collar. At this time, Marquis Duanmu knew what the lightning formation armor was. Celestial metal was meteoric metal. This thumb-sized piece of celestial metal had all the characteristics of meteoric metal. The unique straight patterns formed by melting and condensing, the overlapping profound natural patterns, and the countless burn and melting marks on the surface. Yet none of the celestial metal he had ever seen was as special as this. Because between each natural pattern of this piece of celestial metal, lightning was shooting out. The presence that made them feel terror came from inside this piece of celestial metal from the lightning. This piece of celestial metal was like a natural lightning formation. Their perception could not penetrate deep. There seemed to be a sea of lightning hidden in the thin piece of metal. This kind of celestial metal was not a natural and terrifying seal weapon. It was as if this meteorite had collided with countless thunderclouds when it fell. Under some kind of unique reaction, these thunderclouds were forcibly absorbed and engraved into the meteorite. In the end, these thunderclouds became the only remaining magic array in the meteorite. There was a rumbling sound. A golden bolt of lightning surged out of the hills and met the pale, white starfire falling from the sky. The Wuji Empress Dowager looked calmly at this bolt of lightning. Just like she had said before, Zheng Xiu would not gain any benefits, because all the lightning absorbed by this seal weapon came from this part of the world. At the same time, a crystal pillar appeared in the hands of the seemingly stupid attendant by the stream. In the next moment, The crystal pillar in the attendant's hands started to shine. A beam of light shot out of the pillar. The light immediately surpassed the lightning and starfire in the air, and all the light in the world. Marquis Duanmu felt a shadow cover his body. This was the presence of death. Chapter 765. To Marquis Duanmu, the attendant's cultivation was as young as her. When she released her vital energy, the light that first lit up in her hand was as insignificant as a firefly in Marquis Duanmu's perception. Yet this bit of light seemed to pass through countless cycles in the crystal pillar in her hand. Each time it passed through, its power multiplied. Even more importantly, it was fast and transparent. Marquis Duanmu felt that even if his power was slightly stronger than this light would still pass through. He was like a warrior in heavy armor who was unable to block an armor-piercing arrow. When this presence of death covered Marquis Duanmu's body, a Realm 7 Grandmaster behind him was the first to react. With a shout, the life bond energy of this subordinate who was loyal to Marquis Duanmu surged. 2 wheels of light, one white and one black, appeared in his hands. This Grandmaster's life bond item was a pair of flying hoops, a rare weapon. This pair of flying hoops spun furiously in his hands according to his thoughts, and faced the terrifying light. The golden lightning and the pale white starfire crossed. Almost at the same time, the black and white wheels crossed with the light. Thunder roared in the distant sky, and then there was a clear tearing sound. This tearing sound rang in the eardrums of everyone in the valley, accompanied by intense pain. In the next moment, everyone could no longer hear anything in the world. The world was deathly silent. The Wuji Empress Dowager pressed her lips together, enduring the blinding pain, and looked proudly at the sky. The pale white starfire shattered like a porcelain vase in the air. The thick golden lightning was like a broken golden tree stump in the air. The golden lightning even formed a solid fracture. In the next breath, the lightning from these openings began to drift outwards. However, at the same time, it drew the response of the world even further away. Countless strands of astral lightning energy were instantly drawn over, causing even more lightning to dance in the air like giant snakes. The falling lightning whipped aimlessly and did not have much true power. But when they hit the pale, white starfire in the air, they seemed to be slapping their faces. The Wuji Empress Dowager felt it was a pity that she could not hear this sound. She was certain that the sound of the lightning whipping the starfire was very similar to the sound of face slapping. In this temporarily silent world, Marquis Duanmu turned around. He saw a cloud of dust rise from the body of the subordinate behind him. The black and white wheels of light were still spinning, but they could not stop this light beam in time. This streak of light rushed in between the 2 wheels of light. This subordinate's clothes and flesh from his chest to his back were instantly turned into flying dust, scattering everywhere. In this moment, Marquis Duanmu's eyes were filled with despair, terror, and incomprehension. What had resisted Zheng Xiu's starfire sword was naturally the lightning formation armor that the Wuji Empress Dowager spoke of. But the crystal pillar in her attendant's hand was definitely not the legendary Wuji Nine-Eyed Heavenly Pearl. Then what was it? How could a cultivator who was so far away from Realm 7 kill a Realm 7? Treasure Light Temple. A green-clothed man beside him shouted angrily, but even he couldn't hear his own angry voice. When this light beam hit his colleague, he sensed a familiar presence. This presence came from Changling's Treasure Light Temple. In the past, when the Grandmaster of Treasure Light Temple had disobeyed Zheng Xiu's decree, he had fought against Mo Shoqing and died. Only one direct disciple remained. This young attendant was not from Wuji, but the female direct disciple of Treasure Light Temple, Hu Jingjing. She was from the Qin. A general like him, who had fought for the dynasty his entire life, could not tolerate such a betrayal. Even though he knew what ruthless methods Zheng Xiu had used to make the cultivation places of Chongling listen to her decree, the betrayal of the Qin and the death of his companion still caused him to be so angry he could not control his rationality. A blue light appeared among the scattered lightning and starfire. This indigo-robed grandmaster turned into a stream of light and arrived in front of Hu Jingjing by the stream. The difference between a Realm 7 grandmaster and ordinary cultivators was not just in the power of vital energy and the amount of primal energies of the universe they could gather, but also in the speed of moving vital energy, perception, and everything else. In front of this indigo-robed grandmaster, the distance of several hundred feet seemed to disappear in an instant. When he arrived in front of Hu Jingjing, in everyone's view, Hu Jingjing, who had just attacked, did not have time to react. She did not even have time to move her legs. There was a hiss. The indigo-robed grandmaster's dark red sword light penetrated Hu Jingjing's body. But what shocked this indigo-robed grandmaster first, and then Marquis Duanmu and the others, was that no blood flowed out of Hu Jingjing's body. This indigo-robed grandmaster did not even sense that his sword light had penetrated something tangible. That hiss was the sound of his sword light penetrating the air and light. Refraction. Sky Nether Crystal. This indigo-robed grandmaster was the strategist of Marquis Duanmu's army, Pang Yu. He was the most knowledgeable of all of Marquis Duanmu's retainers. In this moment he reacted. From the very beginning, the maidservant who was drying the dried meat by the stream was not in the place he could see or sense. Even the beam of light did not come from the place he could see. Everything was an illusion created by the combination of the secret arts of Treasure Light Temple and the legendary Sky Nether Crystal in the hands of the female student. She was just a girl who was still wet behind the ears. But in this battle, she was able to reach a level similar to Zheng Xiao. Over there! A subordinate to Marquis Duanmu's left caught a strange shadow out of the corner of his eye. He shouted. However, the others were still deaf and could not hear his voice, so he was the only one who turned his head. That was the direction they had come from. Under a snowy peak they had passed through, at the line where the snow met the frozen ground, there was an unusual light flashing. They could vaguely see the figure of a similar attendant. Formation. There was definitely a powerful amplification formation set up there. Otherwise, even the secret arts of Treasure Light Temple that were suited to the Sky Nether Crystal could not allow a cultivator to kill a Realm 7. But this discovery seemed to be too late. The indigo-robed grandmaster's body froze slightly. Marquis Duanmu sensed the movement of the subordinate beside him. He turned around but did not see Hu Jingjing immediately. His gaze was attracted by the ice peak closest to the valley. A flat wave of energy appeared on that ice peak. Inconceivably, that ice peak was cut in two near the top like a small icicle. The top part of the ice peak slid down towards the valley. Chapter 766. The collapse of the ice mountain would naturally cause an enormous avalanche. With a terrifying roar, ice and snow rolled down, forming a terrifying flood. Any cultivator who had seen an avalanche before knew that this type of snowfall would become faster and faster. When a small snowball rolled down from a tall mountain approached the snow line at the foot of the mountain, it would become who knew how many times larger. Moreover, along the way, it would carry with it even more ice and snow. In the records of history, some of the great avalanches that swallowed up entire armies, or even entire tribes in the snowy plains, were often just small pieces of ice and snow that fell due to some sounds. Some of them were just because travelers spoke a bit too loudly, surging through the valleys, shattering several icicles on the glaciers. If a section of such an icy mountain was directly cut off and rolled down, the resulting avalanche would completely engulf the entire valley. Even a Realm 7 Grandmaster did not have the confidence to survive such an avalanche. "Are you crazy?" Marquis Duanmu's expression changed completely. He looked in disbelief at the old woman in front of the tent. Did the other want to be buried here with them? The Wuji Empress Dowager did not respond. She regretfully landed on the ground under her feet. When this land was covered in ice and snow, all the vegetation would die. In the next few years, this place would not be able to grow such beautiful flowers again. Just as she lowered her head, a voice rang out. The cold waves of air already swept over first, sweeping the several white-roofed imperial tents behind her into the sky like kites. A pillar of light passed through the wind and snow and landed on her body. This pillar of light came from the snow line where the Treasure Light Temple student Hu Jingjing was. At this time, Hu Jingjing did not hide her true location. She fearlessly sent her vital energy into the crystal pillar in her hand. The light from the pillar passed through the cold wind and snow, but still caused everyone to feel a warm feeling. When the warm light gathered into a pillar of light and landed on the Wuji Empress Dowager, other than the warmth, everyone felt an unusually gentle but powerful vitality enter the Wuji Empress Dowager's body. For Marquis Duanmu and the others, this feeling was like the vitality of the young female student from Treasure Light Temple had connected with the old woman, sending her vitality into the old woman's body. But at the same time, these Chongling cultivators who knew of Hu Jingjing's identity knew this was an illusion. Treasure Light Temple did not have a secret art like this. This power that made people feel alive came from the power of the Heaven Abyss crystal in Hu Jingjing's hand. But even if he understood, what could it change? The Wuji Empress Dowager's presence suddenly grew like a giant standing up again. She laughed, her face glowing. She knew better than these cultivators who had come from afar that even with the nourishment of the energy in the sky abyss crystal, her youthful vitality could only last for a short moment. But this short moment was enough for her to complete this scheme she had planned for a long time. Under such a shocking avalanche, everyone had to escape. But the key was who would be able to escape. Her aura was still expanding, but her body had already flown into the sky. She followed Hu Jingjing's beam of light and flew towards the hill where Hu Jingjing was. The wind and snow were very cold, but Marquis Duanmu and the others felt even colder. Their eyes had turned white, because the world in front of them had turned completely white. Shattered ice and snow flew to an unimaginable height and reached the height of the white clouds in the sky. A shadow was collapsing. That was the source of the avalanche, the snowy peak that had fallen. Marquis Duanmu hesitated for a breath. Then he flew towards the Wuji Empress Dowager, who was flying through the air. He did not have the confidence to survive such power. He also did not feel that the Wuji Empress Dowager could escape like this. Because even if the Wuji Empress Dowager used the power of the sky abyss crystal to return to her youth, the power she showed in this moment was similar to theirs. He was not willing to lose like this. Also, if there was a chance of survival in this calamity, it would be on the Wuji Empress Dowager. As his figure flew up, 3 sharp sword chis appeared behind him. His remaining 3 subordinates also flew up and followed behind him. These 3 subordinates were like wings helping him fly. The 3 sword energies of different strengths cut and blocked the oncoming wind and snow, so he was faster than the Wuji Empress Dowager. The 4 straight sword chis rapidly approached the pillar of light and the old woman in the pillar of light. Marquis Duanmu was confident he could stop this old woman. He could even see the red wrinkles on the old woman's face. If they had to die, then they would all die here. But at this time, he suddenly saw the old woman give a strange smile. He saw her say something to him. Right now, his ears were still in endless pain. Even though it was no longer silent, the wind and thunder were incessant. He couldn't hear the fine sounds in this calamity, but through her lips, he could clearly hear the words she said. "You forgot I told you at the start that I have 2 attendants here." Marquis Duanmu's breathing suddenly stopped. He suddenly looked up. Amidst the snowstorm, the giant shadow that was constantly disintegrating suddenly sped up by several times. A sparkling and translucent ice tip was even faster than the cold wind, piercing through the fluttering snow. Inside this translucent ice tip, there was a cold and terrifying sword essence that he was familiar with. His pupils contracted violently. In the next moment, he let out an incomparably shrill roar and released all the origin Yuan Qi in his body. There was a muffled boom. Ice and snow danced outwards. Even the wind and snow that came down from the sky seemed to be scattered in this moment. A clear space appeared in the sky. In the distance, many cavalry who had rushed oversaw a shocking scene. In a huge circle of snow, a section of ice peak collided with several rays of majestic sword chi. There seemed to be the figure of a young woman in that glowing ice peak. In the next moment, the ice peak collapsed in the air. Snowflakes as tall as mountains swept across the sky, even engulfing the dazzling beam of light. The bodies of all of those cultivators in the air disappeared into the countless piles of snow that collided chaotically in the air. The Wuji cavalry, who had rushed over from the distance, looked in shock. They could not control their steeds and could not get close. Chapter 767. The snow flow completely engulfed the warm valley, filling it up completely. The roaring sounds continued to ring out, and even the snowy mountains in the distance had avalanches of varying degrees due to the huge reverberations. The brave Wuji cavalry immediately reached the edge of the avalanche. Some members of the imperial family, riding blue wolves, immediately charged into the wind and snow. Yet in front of the roiling snow, these imperial family members could not get close to the slope where the Wuji Empress Dowager had been. These imperial family members stopped with ugly expressions. The snow in front of them was like bubbles that piled up in layers. After many heavy breaths, the snow gradually stopped, the wind quieted, and the world gradually cleared up. At this time, their bodies suddenly froze. They saw a scene they would never forget. The fading wind and snow could not block the light. The pillar of light that had guided the Wuji Empress Dowager was still shining. The difference was that the female student of Treasure Light Temple, Wu Jingjing, was walking down. The warm pillar of light from her crystal pillar landed on a spot on the slope. Where the pillar of light landed, there were two piles of glowing ice. For these cultivators, this was not hard to understand. When powerful energy blew away the ice and snow fragments and squeezed the ice and crystals together, it would naturally produce this kind of seemingly untainted ice. What shocked them were the figures in the two piles of ice. Slightly higher up on the hillside, where the warm beam of light always shrouded, there were 4 straight crystal icicles. At the center of the 4 ice pillars stood the Wuji Empress Dowager and a blue-robed young woman. The young woman still gave off powerful sword essence, and it was possible to see threads blooming in the air. The 4 regularly shaped ice pillars were clearly formed by her sword essence, and carried a coldness completely different from the ice and snow in this part of the world. On the other hand, the other pile of ice was unusually messy. Marquis Duanmu's 4 subordinates had completely turned into ice sculptures. They held their swords and protected Marquis Duanmu in the center. However, their bodies had been pierced by the ice in many places and then frozen again. The power in their bodies caused the ice around them to become unusually chaotic spikes. Each spike flashed with a terrifying cold light. In the narrow space formed by the 4, Marquis Duanmu did not have any ice on his body, just a layer of white frost like the autumn frost on the tiles of Chongling. However, his face, his expression, was instead even more gloomy than those for already dead subordinates, even more unpleasant to look at. Looking at his current appearance, everyone understood what kind of person was like with a dead heart. The Wuji Empress Dowager moved. Her steps were as steady as usual. When they saw her walk out of the center of the 4 ice pillars, the shocked Wuji cavalry gave a tsunami of cheers. The Chongling Marquis darkness, helplessness, hopelessness, and unwillingness showed off her might and power. "Why don't you just die?" The Wuji Empress Dowager walked in front of Marquis Duanmu and said slowly. Her words were calm, without any disdain, and even a hint of sympathy. When he saw all his loyal subordinates die in battle, but could not change the result of this battle, this was the saddest thing. You may understand now why Wang Jingming did not choose to escape back then, and had to fight to the death in Chongling. Looking at the speechless Marquis Duanmu, the Wuji Empress Dowager said with a sigh, "Bailey Sushua destroyed your mind first, and then you did not expect to die at the hands of his direct disciple. You Marquises always think you are on the same level as Bailey Sushua and the top cultivators of the Bazenkendo ground. I fear that you will only discover this is not the case when you are truly defeated." Why is it like this? Marquis Duanmu struggled to lift his head. He looked at the old woman and the two attendants, the young cultivators from Chongling. He did not want to admit defeat, but he could not understand the old woman's words. The old woman's words struck his heart. He could not imagine why there was such a great disparity between him and Bailey Sushue and the others. They were both Realm 7 and had cultivated arduously. He had grown up with more difficult experiences than Bailey Sushue and fought more battles. Let's start from the battle itself. The Wuji Empress Dowager looked coolly at him. She looked at the distant cavalry of the country that she was in charge of and said softly, "You do not understand me well enough. I was able to rule Wuji all these years without relying on my cultivation and combat power. Spirit and resolve can create courage and victory. Your failure is that after the people of the Bazinkindo ground died back then, among the outstanding cultivators of Chongling, other than Yi Siling, Emo Shoching, and a few others, there were not many people who valued external things more than their own interests. The cultivators of the Bazinkindo ground who died back then could fight to the death for a reason they thought was right. But you Marquises mostly chose to stand on the side of Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu because of the benefits you received. You people are fundamentally different from Bailey Sushue and the others. So even if you do everything you can to catch up, even if you use all the resources the Qin dynasty can provide you, you can only look up to them. You will not even be as good as Yi Siling and the other rising stars. In this battle, there were many times when you didn't think about fulfilling military orders, but about your own survival. That's why you missed many opportunities. My arrangements led to this result. I do not know if your subordinates thought it through before they died." The Wuji Empress Dowager paused for a moment. She looked respectfully at the cultivators sealed in the ice and said coolly, "They received your kindness, or became loyal to you out of friendship. But following a leader like you, they did not have much of a future from the start. They will not have much success. Even if they sacrifice their lives, what kind of mark can they leave in the history books?" She said many things to Marquis Duanmu. While she was speaking, Marquis Duanmu didn't say anything. She did not care what Marquis Duanmu was thinking right now. For a true expert like her, she only needed to lead others to follow her own rhythm. You are one of the 13 Marquises of the Qin dynasty. To opponents like you, I will give my last respect. She was slightly tired and said the last word she wanted to say to Marquis Duanmu. The final word, respect, meant a dignified death. If one did not have the ability to fight, it was suicide. Chapter 768. A defeated expert was still an expert. New cultivators would appear in the cultivation lands of each dynasty each year. Those people who were strong enough to be recorded in the history books had many experiences worthy of respect. When Marquis Duanmu decided to commit suicide, he felt great respect for this old Wuji woman. Because in Wuji and other dynasties, it would be more difficult for women to take charge of politics than men. Even more importantly, this old Wuji woman had never relied on her own power. Maybe if I had met you 15 years earlier and lost to you earlier, it would have been different. When he finally lowered his head and let a sharp ice tip pierce his throat, he said seriously. The Wuji Empress Dowager did not respond, but she understood the meaning of this Qin dynasty marquis. If Marquis Duanmu could see himself clearly back then his achievements on the path of cultivation would be very different. You lost again. She did not look at Marquis Duanmu and turned to look at the place where the white star fire had fallen. She said slowly with a smug smile at the corners of her mouth, "You really want the nine-eyed heavenly pearl, but you can't think of who has it." Under the contrast of the white snow, the old Wuji woman's eyes still appeared dim and turbid. The power of the sky nether crystal only made her younger for a moment. After the light bloomed, it seemed to burn more of her energy. Yet both Hu Jingjing and Xie Ro felt that this old woman's gaze was filled with kindness and wisdom. The two young girls were very pure. The purer they were, the more they could see the essence of things. The two of them felt that this old Wuji woman could win against the mistress of Chongling because she could see people's hearts and knew who could be trusted. The sky was cloudy, but it did not rain. Many of the residences in the Chu capital were lit up with lanterns. In the river outside the Chu capital, where the nether floats had once appeared, the waves were somewhat turbulent, but the wind happened to come from downstream. This naturally made it convenient for many merchant ships going upstream. There were more merchant ships on the river than usual. In a small river bend near the Chu capital, there was a small boat. The famous fourth Mr. Zhao was on this boat. She was alone, drinking the sweet water sold in the Chu capital, and looking at the starry lights of the Chu capital. In the sugar water, there were evenly cut pear pieces and some dried longans. After being cooked in the sugar water, they became fat again, exuding a very pleasant fragrance. The more you see, the wider your horizons will be. No matter if it was the exquisite food, or the beautiful buildings even in the cloudy sky, or the breathtaking lines created by the craftsmen, all of it made her sigh. She sighed that this ancient dynasty had more resources than her homeland, the great Zhao dynasty. Just like how the wind can blow the sails and carry the ship forward, just like how this bowl of sugar water will turn cold if left out for too long, there are many things in this world that are inevitable. She admitted that the Zhao dynasty under the rule of that muddle-headed emperor would have been destroyed sooner or later, even if not for opponents like the Qin and Bazinkindo ground. It was just that the things that had happened could not be forgotten. A boat floated over from downstream. The speed of the ship was not fast, but there was a unique aura that naturally attracted her perception. She put down the half-empty bowl of sugar water, used a rough cloth handkerchief to wipe the corners of her mouth, and then waited calmly. Seeing the boat move, she did not give off any vital energy vibrations, but only she knew that her presence was becoming more and more perfect. Not long ago, she had exchanged blows with Chi Siren. At the time, she was full of fighting spirit, and her condition was at its peak. But compared to now, that battle could only be said to be a warm-up. A battle that could be called an epic was not just about who the opponents were, the strength of their cultivation, but also the meaning it represented. In the last 50 years of the cultivation world, what the cultivators imagined and anticipated the most was the battle between the Grandmaster of the Zhao Sword Furnace and the first swordsman of the world, Wang Jingming. But this battle did not happen in the end. When she had fought Chi Siren that day, Zhao Fourth Mr. Zhao Miao knew that she had comprehended all the sword essences that her master wanted her to comprehend, and was infinitely close to her master's level. But today, as she watched the boat come closer, she knew that she was infinitely close, and not equal or surpassing. Only a fated opponent like this, an opponent her sect had waited for many years, could allow her to stand at such a height. When the two boats were less than 50 feet apart, and she saw Ding Ning's face on the bow, she nodded slightly and stood with her hands behind her back. At this time, she was certain that he was no different from her master back then. The Zhao Sword Furnace is extraordinary as expected, full of talents. Ding Ning looked at her and said calmly. Such words might sound polite or fake from other people's mouths, but it was completely different from him. Zhao Miao raised an eyebrow slightly and accepted the praise. Then she asked, "You were in Jiaodong Commandery. Why did you suddenly come here?" "Fetching an old friend and taking care of some matters," Ding Ning answered. Zhao Miao immediately understood, and her eyes flashed. "Bailey Sushue is about to arrive?" Ding Ning did not speak and just nodded. Zhao Miao took a deep breath, looked at him and said, "You owe the Zhao Sword Furnace a blow." Ding Ning said, "I owe the Zhao Sword Furnace." Zhao Miao thought seriously and said, "Do you want to change the time?" This was not a planned duel, but a coincidence. But in her view, if Ding Ning had important matters to attend to, this duel could be postponed. No need. But Ding Ning shook his head and said, "It is better to meet at the right time than deliberately." After a pause, Ding Ning looked at the distant sky and said softly, "I have waited for this blow for many years. Also, in this Chu capital, if there is someone like your master that I respect, I will not come so casually." Zhao Miao nodded again in greeting. Previously, she had bowed for herself. This time, she was bowing for her master. "Then let's start?" she asked. "How can such a sword move silently, without the audience it deserves?" Ding Ning looked at the city walls of the Chu capital not far away. He looked at the newly built city walls and the tallest city gate and smiled. Zhao Miao immediately understood Ding Ning's meaning. She also smiled proudly. Then as you wish. Zhang Sun Qianxue was in the canopy of the small boat and was sipping a new pot of wine. This time, she did not casually wear the most ordinary clothes. Instead, she wore a snow-white dress. This pot of wine was not the coarse wine casually made in falling parasol, but the wine that only the Gongsun family, the head of the old nobility, knew how to make. Chapter 769. The best wine, the grandest clothing, the most beautiful woman. What was worthy of them was naturally the most important matter. The two ships moved with the waves, slowly moving towards the tallest city walls of the Chu capital. The first sword of the world, Wang Jingming, and the Grand Master of the Zhao Sword Furnace, had been cultivators at the peak of the world. After many years, only Yuan Wu, who had flattened a mountain with one blow at the Deer Mountain Conference, and Bailey Sushue, who had fought his way into the Chongling Imperial Palace from Min Mountain Sword Sect. That Zhao Sword Furnace Grandmaster had passed away, but Zhao Si had taken his blow. She represented the Zhao Sword Furnace right now. The first sword of the world, the Zhao Sword Furnace, and the eldest miss of the Gongsun family, one of the former leaders of Chongling's old nobility, had come together to receive Bailey Sushue. This was naturally the most important matter. Ding Ning stood at the bow of the ship, looking at the approaching city. His expression was still calm, and his presence had not changed. But he knew his cultivation was becoming more and more perfect. This city had been taken by Su Fu's army and the cultivators of the Qi dynasty. When the Qi emperor and Zheng Xiu finished dividing their benefits, the Qin army had taken the leading position here. Some of the Qin troops who had fought from the Qin and Chu border to here, especially the subordinates of the marquises who had died in battle, had stopped around the Chu capital to reorganize. In his life, or rather in Wang Jingming's life, when he was the strongest and most perfect, he had fought his way into Chongling alone and fought an entire city alone. One person fighting an entire city was not just tragic. That kind of scene could force a cultivator to burn their life to the strongest. When he had taken over the floating city of Jiaodong Commandery and officially entered Realm 7, Ding Ning's vital energy cultivation was even more perfect than in the past. Because he had made up for many deficiencies in his cultivation and had obtained the benefits of many powerful cultivation methods that he had not been able to obtain in the past. However, he himself understood that he still needed an opportunity to completely ignite the self that had been dormant for many years. Only then would he be able to completely reach and surpass his past self. This large city was very close to Chongling in the past. This was the opportunity he had created himself. Compared to this great city, and even compared to the fleet of large ships sailing on the great river, these two small boats seemed too small and lonely. No one knew that Ding Ning had entered the Chu territory. Much of the information came from Jiaodong Commandery. When Jiaodong Commandery was completely controlled by the Bazin Kendo ground and the Chu army led by Consort Zhao, the power of the Zheng family was swept away. Jiaodong Commandery was like a mysterious world isolated from the outside world. However, a Grandmaster had his own temperament. Even if he did not release any fluctuation of the Qi of heaven and earth, he would still be able to do so. When the two small boats were still several li away from the port, they had already attracted the attention of the guards on the city gate tower. They had not received any notice from above. The powerful cultivators who had come were uninvited guests, especially now that the Chu was not peaceful. The Qin dynasty only controlled 2 or 3/10 of the land. The generals on the city walls had high status in the warden's office, so these two silent boats were very strange to them. Out of consideration for the fact that the other party was a powerful cultivator, the guards on the city gate tower maintained a certain degree of restraint, not immediately having the fast ships in the port head over to intercept and question them. However, when those two small boats directly passed through the dock port, following the flow of water towards the gate of the moat, and then continued towards the city walls, all of the guards' hearts began to tighten. But even at this time, these soldiers, including the increasing number of cultivators on the city gate tower, did not think that the person on the boat wanted to face the city alone. In their fixed thinking, no matter how powerful a grandmaster was, it was impossible for one or two people to openly face so many armies and kill their way into the city. In their subconscious, that matter had happened many years ago, and even that person had died in Chongling. This kind of fixed thinking caused their subconscious to not connect the people on the small boats with the people who had killed their way into Chongling back then. The highest guard on the city gate tower still did not give any warning, but military orders were secretly sent into the city at the fastest speed. More and more cultivators rushed over. Many large military weapons had finished their training and were ready to be activated at any time. Some unique sounds and vibrations of energy produced light that flashed through the city gate tower. This was the most murderous warning. However, there was still no movement from the people on the two boats. Under their increasingly nervous and cold gazes, the two small boats arrived in front of the gate leading to the moat. This gate controlled the water level of the moat to always be higher than the river outside. When the gate opened, the water would flood into the river. This way, even if large numbers of enemy ships approached the city through the river, they would go against the flow and would be swept far away in an instant. At the time, the Netherfloat fleet of the Qin dynasty had traveled underwater, and the armored ships were too heavy. With the yin energy of the Qi dynasty cultivators protecting them, they were not affected by the water flow when they destroyed the gate and charged at the city walls. However, today, before the two small boats even touched the heavy iron gate, the gate suddenly cracked. Large amounts of water charged out of the gate, and the power was much more terrifying than when the gate was fully opened. What made the pupils of many cultivators on the city walls immediately contract, their bodies immediately surging with coldness, was that the two leaf small boats instead easily tore through the water flow, easily entering their line of sight again, and then continued towards the city gate's southern tower. This silent and casual feeling caused people to feel inexplicably dangerous. Adding on the destruction of the gate, the guard on the city gate did not hesitate and gave multiple orders. Loud shouts could be heard. Then the shouts were drowned out by the sound of the air being torn apart like a tide. A dark green flame arrow instantly lit up the gloomy sky outside the city. This was not a test. This was one of the strongest seal weapons of the Qin dynasty army, and had once appeared at the Deer Mountain Conference. One sword each. Do not waste energy. When the light of the green arrows appeared behind the city walls, Ding Ning said to Zhao Miao next to him, "I will go first." Zhao Miao nodded her head in an unusually straightforward manner. Then, she took a step towards the city gate tower that wasn't far away. The moment her feet left the boat, two footprints appeared at the bow of the small boat under her, where she was standing. Two bright red footprints could be seen. The hard wooden board had turned to red charcoal. In the next moment, the small boat under her disappeared with a boom, turning into countless pieces of burning charcoal that shot into the sky. Those dark green flame arrows originally contained a terrifying amount of heat, enough to melt rocks. However, compared to these fiery red charcoal fragments, the difference was like the difference between firewood that was about to burn out and the fire that was gushing out of a pill furnace. There was a strange vibration in the air. The heat from the flaming arrows that fell like a tide could not be condensed. Instead, they were evaporated like water droplets and burned even higher into the sky with the endless heat. An enormous burning cloud formed in the sky above this section of the city wall. The soldiers and cultivators on the city walls felt even colder, but when they were burned by the true heat, they felt as though they had fallen into the heat of summer, and they sweated profusely. Fourth, Mr. Zhao, a cultivator on the city wall, squeezed out the words. Chapter 770. The power of these arrows was attracted by the other's sword essence and turned into a sky-burning presence. In the world, only the grandmasters of the Zhao sword hut could control fire to such a degree. The woman who jumped up from the small boat was small in stature. She could only be the legendary fourth Mr. Zhao, who was as famous as Bai Shanshui. All the soldiers and cultivators on the walls could not imagine why this legendary Zhao cultivator would appear in public like this. Many soldiers and generals were dazed for a moment when the flames burned the sky. Yet when some seal weapons were activated and some sharp wind brushed against the flames, creating muffled howls, the dozens of swordsmen waiting on the walls reacted at the same time. Many cultivators of the Qin dynasty were independent individuals in the military. They did not need military orders. They judged the situation in battle and acted according to their own judgment. The swordsmen of Chongling were originally brave and proud. While they were intimidated by fourth Mr. Zhao's name, fourth Mr. Zhao's disregard for others as he walked towards the city gates ignited the fighting spirit of these swordsmen. Dozens of flying swords suddenly passed through the fire curtain with different sounds. Most of the flying swords in the military were skilled at hiding danger, especially in cooperation. Most of these dozens of flying swords only created a clear whirlpool when they passed through the fire curtain, a faint trail of fire, and then suddenly disappeared as though they did not exist. In the air that was scorched by the true fire, there were only a few streaks of violent sword Dao that could be clearly seen. But for cultivators, the flying swords of Chongling were the most threatening when they disappeared without a trace. In the next moment, these disappearing flying swords might appear from under the roof tiles, from the shadows under one's feet, from a splash on the water, or from a flame falling from the sky, and come within a few feet of fourth Mr. Zhao. Some flying swords might arrive from different angles at the same time. Some flying swords might purposely be late. Some might still be hiding sinisterly, searching for a gap in the other's attack, or a moment when the vital energy flow was not smooth. Dozens of swordsmen who could control flying swords that could create countless possibilities in a breath. Dozens of flying swords were countless sword shadows. Moreover, they were the first batch of sword masters to react. There would be more sword masters gathering on this section of the city wall, and there would be more sword masters attacking. In the subconscious minds of these Chongling swordsmen, no cultivator had ever been able to face so many flying swords head-on. So when the experts of the enemy countries were discovered in Chongling, they could only flee and not fight. Thus, from their point of view, even if fourth Mr. Zhao did not retreat, he could only continue to fight. It was impossible for him to continue walking towards the city gate tower, as if there was no one around him. However, the scene in front of them caused their gazes to freeze again. Zhao Miao simply didn't care about these dozens of flying swords. She didn't change her direction at all. As if she was taking a stroll in the courtyard, she swept through the air and stepped towards the center of the roof of the city gate tower. Because she had Ding Ning behind her, she had already used her sword to block the seal weapons of the Qin army. The following flying swords were Ding Ning's problem and had nothing to do with her. Chi! A cracking sound was heard. A flying sword was the first to sense her withdrawal of power. With a hint of disbelief, it suddenly sped up, creating an icy sword shadow in the air and slicing towards her neck. In the instant that this flying sword flew out, the originally calm space within a few feet or even several tens of feet around her suddenly became chaotic and chaotic. Ding Ning's left hand left his waist. However, in this chaotic space, tiny white flowers bloomed quietly. Everything seemed to slow down. A remnant sword hit the first flying sword. With a soft sound, a ripple spread clearly in the air. More small white flowers bloomed on the remnant sword and floated in the air. That flying sword spun and was sent flying, hitting another flying sword that had just flown out of the shadows under the eaves. The latter shot out and hit a flying sword that was falling from above like a meteor. In the eyes of all the cultivators, that remnant sword that was blooming with small white flowers only hit a few flying swords. The entire process was clear, but when these flying swords spun out, they immediately changed the entire situation. There were flying swords flying around Zhao Miao's body, but her body seemed to become a kind of demonic power that blocked the existence of these flying swords. No flying sword could land on her body. Not a single flying sword could land on the body of the owner of the broken sword behind her. All the flying swords were still flying in the air, but most of the masters forgot to control their flying swords at this moment. Everyone's gaze and perception left forth Mr. Zhao's body and landed on Ding Ning behind her. Those flying swords were still blooming in the air. The chaos gave off an indescribable feeling of clarity, as if every flying sword was in its proper position. The sound of those flying swords colliding with each other was like music with a unique rhythm. There were no true gods in this world. But in this moment, looking at Ding Ning's body red from the burning clouds and the remnant sword that seemed to be very quiet, many cultivators felt they were looking at a god. Numerous realm, 7 grandmasters who had not yet acted started to tremble. Great terror rose from the depths of their hearts. This last flower remnant sword represented the other's identity. Easily repelling the encirclement of dozens of flying swords was proof that the other was that person who had returned. There was only one person in the world who could use sword to defeat sword like this. Without relying on brute force, he could clearly sense the sword essence, the path of the sword, and defeat it. It was like a miracle. 2 soft sounds came from the eaves of the turret. Zhao Miao and Ding Ning's feet had landed on the ground. The 2 stood calmly at each end of the city gate tower. Their figures were so tall in the light, but in the eyes of these cultivators, they seemed to be standing in the sky. Many sounds of metal hitting the ground sounded. There were flying swords, many people's weapons, and even formation pivots that activated formations. It was not just the cultivators. When many soldiers realized who the person behind fourth Mr. Zhao was, countless memories and an indescribable surge of emotion, along with an era that seemed to have already disappeared, pressed down on their minds. Once upon a time, that person had been their military god, their war god, an invincible existence who led the charge. The first sword of the world they fervently worshipped and followed. Chapter 771. For the soldiers of the Qin dynasty, bravery was ingrained into their bones, and obedience to military orders was an instinct formed after countless training. For ordinary soldiers and military cultivators, they rarely had the chance to consider whether the orders of their superiors were right or wrong. For some generals who could decide the movements of the entire army, they considered more of a trade-off. This trade-off came from the interests of the entire dynasty and the future, the lives of tens or even hundreds of thousands of their subordinates, and even their families. So when something important to the entire dynasty happened, most of them did not have the right to know. Even in the past in Chongling, when some armies received orders from their superiors and risked their lives to fight, when they finally saw the enemy they were facing, they saw in disbelief that the enemy they were facing was the person they passionately worshipped and loved. For the soldiers and cultivators of the Qin dynasty, they did not even have the chance to choose. They were not in Chongling. They only heard the result of the story. They were still fighting like normal, chasing in the footsteps of their heroes. But in a night, everything changed. The Bazin Kendo ground no longer existed. The heroes and war gods in their hearts had all become traitors, and they quickly disappeared from the history of this dynasty. In the next few years, even the history books related to these people were burned, as if it was just a dream. Nothing was left behind after the wind blew by last night. They had no right to change anything. All they could do was continue to grip their weapons and fight for their family and loved ones, for the better future of the dynasty. But as time passed, did some things really fade and have no effect on them? At least, not everyone was like this. At least, some people's burning emotions hidden deep in their hearts erupted at this moment. At least, many people followed their most sincere emotions at this time. After the sound of metal hitting the ground, other than some distant sounds of tearing through the air and footsteps, the entire world grew silent. This section of the wall was so quiet that only the sound of heartbeats and breathing could be heard. Looking up at the 2 people standing opposite each other in the sky, some people suddenly burst into tears. It wasn't because of sadness, but because of an extremely complicated emotion. In the next few breaths of time, many soldiers and cultivators took half a step back. They raised the ordinary iron swords in their hands, or the various famous swords from various cultivation places. Then they held the swords horizontally in front of their chests and bowed slightly. This was not a challenge, but a salute. It represented what choice they would have made if they had been in Chongling back then. In the Chongling of the past, such a choice meant death. In the present Chu capital, such a move might bring death. But to die for the emperor, this represented the highest respect. Zhao Miao looked quietly at this scene and said to Ding Ning, "My master told me that it is not easy to be remembered by many people. If you can do what many people say you are a good person, your life will be enough. As a person, countless people would give their lives to you. Even he couldn't do that because he wouldn't give up so much. He only wants peace and quiet, a place where he can live in peace." Different ages, different life experiences will create different thoughts. Ding Ning did not have a proud expression and responded calmly, "But I am very comforted, because justice is in people's hearts." After saying this to Zhao Miao, he added softly. Zhao Miao did not say anything else. She slowly raised her head. The sky suddenly darkened. A light rain suddenly fell. Just now, the seal weapons and the heat from her true fire had evaporated large amounts of water in the moat into the air. At this time, these raindrops were condensed from the water vapor. Each drop was unusually crystallized, like the dew on the grass in the morning. Just as she raised her head, a rainbow appeared in the sky. The rainbow was reflected in the depths of her eyes, reflecting countless burning emotions. Her body started to burn. Justice was in people's hearts. Even though her master had been charged with treason and died in the schemes of that incapable ruler, there would be public opinion afterwards. All the cultivators in the world would feel respect when they mentioned her master. She was very at ease. She had traveled for many years under her master's orders, but she finally had a place to return to. At this time, she was at ease. The thread of anger that usually wrapped around her heart disappeared. Her mind was even clearer and higher. At this time, she seemed to be standing where the Zhao sword furnace had been in the past. Any trace of true fire that gushed out of her body carried a kind of holy light, which was shocking. There was a loud bang. Her right hand clenched. There was no sword in her hand, but the image of a sword furnace appeared in the world and smashed down towards Ding Ning's head. It was an unusually simple and violent blow. The Zhao sword furnace that would never change in her heart was the sword. Eternity was actually a very illusory thing, because no one had ever seen true eternity. But if something gave people the feeling of eternity, it usually meant that it was strong and had power that surpassed the mortal world. All the realm's 7 cultivators in the Chu capital who had seen this blow paled. All these grandmasters felt insignificant and ashamed of their inferiority. They could not imagine that 4th Mr. Zhao would use such a blow, and could not imagine how to defeat it. Ding Ning's eyes were filled with joy and admiration. He had waited for this battle for a long time, and even thought it would never happen again. But this battle finally came, and this sword was as stunning as he had imagined, enough to make the world pale. His body appeared blurry in the twisting air on the top of the city gate tower. He felt like he was evaporating, but he could not help but smile. He used a sword move that he had thought of many years ago. Hiss! He used his fingers as a sword. There was no vast vital energy charging out of his fingers, but the primal energies of the universe that he had gathered started to burn at his fingertips at an astounding speed. A fire sword shot towards the sword furnace ahead. He added more fire to the Zhao sword hut. This flame had 5 colors. It was different from true fire and different from the stars in the sky. But like the legendary fire of 5 flavors, all the cultivators present immediately felt his truest emotions. Everyone seemed to have experienced the joys and sorrows of his years. Sword essence was in this will. The truest human will could be defeated with human will. The fire essence was at its peak. Adding on the truest fire in the world, there was no other vessel to use. The sword furnace shadow that was falling towards Ding Ning gave off a very real cracking sound. Fire spread in all directions. The last flower remnant sword floating at his left hand flew up. Fine white flowers fell down, so beautiful it did not seem to belong to the mortal world. The glowing droplets of water falling from the sky turned into countless streams of water, gently hugging the scattered lines of fire and guiding them towards the great river behind. He had taught Yi Sealing his swordsmanship. No one in the world could do better than him in using water. Tolerance and not mutual destruction. Chapter 772. The water wrapped around the line of fire and fell into the river. There was almost no sound, only white smoke rising. A section of the river instantly dried up. The exposed riverbed cracked like land that had been dehydrated for a long time. In the next moment, the water in the moat surged out even more fiercely, colliding with the water coming from other parts of the river and creating a clear, white wave. The water vapor floated into the air and was cold, causing more raindrops to fall. The furnace that contained heaven and earth and gathered all kinds of fire in the mortal world, which could burn all things, was broken so easily. Looking at the unburned city gate tower and the two people still facing each other, everyone inside and outside the city walls was shocked speechless. So you really can defeat such a sword? Raindrops fell on Zhao Miao's face and rolled down like tears. She looked at Ding Ning and said, "There is no sword form in the world that cannot be defeated." Ding Ning looked at her and said calmly, "If it is a battle of life and death, there will be a follow-up. My master only thought of such a sword against you back then. It seems that I do not understand my master well enough." Zhao Miao slowly closed her eyes, her eyelashes fluttering. She said softly, "He does not want to kill you. He just wants to see if you can handle this sword." Faint sorrow appeared in Ding Ning's eyes. He said, "Killing is not the best method. If a battle of swords can allow us to understand each other's thoughts, there are many things that do not need to be resolved by armies fighting." Zhao Miao took a deep breath. Then she opened her eyes and looked at Ding Ning. She said, "Thank you." There were many things in her words of thanks. Ding Ning's sword had given her more comprehension of the sword path. But more importantly, she seemed to have seen her master's heart. Ding Ning bowed in return. Zhao Miao did not linger and floated to the water behind him. The water in the moat gushed out violently. Only the small boat Zhongsun Qianxue was on was like a reef in the middle of the river, majestic and unmoving. Zhao Miao swept past the small boat and caught the jug of wine that Zhongsun Qianxue threw to her. She smiled at Zhongsun Qianxue and bowed to express her gratitude. Only now did she act like a girl. In the next moment, she stepped on the waves and followed the flow of the river. In the blink of an eye, everyone on the city wall could only see a petite figure. Ding Ning looked at her back, his eyes full of emotions. He could see that with Zhao Miao's departure, she had the intention of leaving the world with all of her grievances gone. If nothing unexpected happened, maybe this fourth Mr. Zhao and the cultivators of the Zhao sword furnace would not interfere in the conflicts of the world. What made him feel gratified and amazed was that she would have great achievements on the path of cultivation in the future. It would only be a matter of time before she surpassed her master. He was the only one left on the city gate tower. But at this time, more people noticed the motionless little boat on the water. Many people started to confirm the identity of Zhongsun Qianxue on the boat. This evoked more memories, but the events of the memories appeared clearly in front of their eyes. This brought more terror to many people. In a certain crowd on the city wall, a cultivator's face was exceptionally pale. From his appearance, he was at most 40 years old, but from the unique sin on his body, he was far from this age. He cowered and lowered his head as though he wanted people to not notice him. But the robes of the Martial Bureau he wore were dazzling. In all of Chongling, there were not many people of the Martial Bureau who had a higher rank than him. Just as he was filled with the impulse to flee, Ding Ning's gaze landed on him. "And Long Yun, do you have something you want to say to me?" There were many people between Ding Ning and this high official of the Martial Bureau, but Ding Ning asked him first. Many of the people present were not surprised. In the rebellion of Chongling back then, including the encirclement of the Bazankendo ground, many of the armies under the command of the Bazankendo ground had rebelled. Some of the generals of the armies had made orders that chilled many people's hearts, and sent their subordinates to their deaths. One person, one order, and they had destroyed their entire army. Because that army was the army of the Bazinkindo ground. And Longyan was one of those generals. But Longyan had not thought that there would be a time when she would face the Ba Mountain sword field again, and that person again. Without any hesitation, when Ding Ning's gaze landed on him, and Longyan started to flee, his body turned into a wild gust of wind and flashed into the depths of the Chu capital. He knew that he was not a match for Ding Ning, but he was a Realm 7 cultivator. If he ran at full power, he had a great chance of escaping. Even more importantly, he was an official of the Qin dynasty. Some armies and cultivators wavered in front of this former military god. As long as Ding Ning did not charge into the city, these armies and cultivators would not even act. But if Ding Ning did not charge into the city, these people's attitudes would be different. However, in just one breath, he felt a strange aura. It was not the threat of death approaching, but the world around him was too quiet. He looked back. What caused his body to stiffen inexplicably was that he saw Ding Ning did not chase after him and was still standing quietly on the top of the city gate tower. The Bazinkindo ground leads armies. While we use tactics, if we encounter a battle to the death, we will lead and never retreat. Have the cultivators of the Qin dynasty become so weak? If this is the case, even if we win the world, we lose face. If you want to fight, then fight. Do not order your troops and have others pay with their lives. If you do not dare to fight, then leave this city. But you must know shame. Ding Ning's voice sounded. While it was not loud, it clearly reached the ears of everyone who could see him. As he spoke, the last flower remnant sword floated next to Ding Ning, reminding everyone of the life of the sword's original master. Countless people started to tremble. Many years ago, the Qin dynasty was not strong compared to the other dynasties, but the Bazinkindo ground led the reform. Wang Jingming and the Bazinkindo ground swordsmen first taught the Qin people bravery, and then fairness and shame. But was this fair to the Bazinkindo ground in the end? Back then, everyone was proud to be a Qin person, not just because the Qin dynasty was the strongest. Was the present Chongling, the present Qin dynasty, the same as before? Quiet cloud sword abyss, Qiuyin Shay, please. A murderous voice sounded. A person jumped up from the city walls and landed towards Ding Ning with a sword light. Ding Ning nodded, held the last flower sword across his chest in a bow, and then swung his sword. There was a tearing sound. The last flower sword easily tore apart this person's sword light and hit this person's chest like a wave, sending him flying out of the air. Qi Linjun of the Mount Qi Sword School, please. Another sword light flew up and charged towards Ding Ning. Ding Ning stood motionless, returned the bow, and attacked. Chapter 773. Sword lights continuously flew up and landed at the top of the city gate tower. Yet Ding Ning only needed one blow to defeat the owners of these sword lights. No one could withstand this blow. If the previous battle between Ding Ning and 4th Mr. Zhao was like a fight between immortals, then this battle was happening in the mortal world. All of these Qin people understood what Ding Ning wanted to express. Today I will stand here. If you think you are my enemy, then come and fight. But this battle was based on the rules of the Qin. They had no shame. So the cultivators charging up the city gate tower to challenge him were of all levels of cultivation. There were Realm 4 and 5 cultivators, and occasionally Realm 7 grandmasters. Yet, to everyone's shock, the boundaries of cultivation did not seem to exist in front of Ding Ning. No matter if it was a Realm 4 or 5 swordsman, or a Realm 6 or 7 cultivator, there was no difference in everyone's eyes. Ding Ning only needed one blow to defeat the cultivator who came forward. Ding Ning only used the last flower remnant sword. For the military of the Qin dynasty, there was definite information that Ding Ning's life bond sword was the best sword in the world. The multicolored sword lights lit up on the city gate tower like fireworks, but they were as short as meteors. The flow of water in the city moat calmed down again. Dressed splendidly, Zhangsun Qinshua looked up at the flame-like sword lights on the city gate tower. Her past absolute coldness was swept away. She did not use a cup and just took a sip from a wine jug. As a flush appeared on her beautiful face, she smiled and gave off an even brighter light. She was not an ordinary girl. Putting aside her family background, she was the most talented young cultivator of her time. Naturally, she had her wild times. Someone who could make her fall in love naturally had many moments in front of her. Seeing Ding Ning casually defeat cultivators, she thought of many scenes when Wang Jingming first entered Chongling. If you're not convinced, then let's fight. That disdainful and arrogant voice seemed to still echo in her ears, but in a trance, more than 10 years had passed. We can definitely stack him to death. Several miles behind the south gate of the Chu capital, in the largest military camp of the Qin army, several generals stood alone on the tallest wooden tower. One of the generals had an extremely ugly expression. He found it difficult to breathe, and the armor on his chest was trembling. Even if his vital energy is almost endless, even if he can replenish his vital energy in battle, there is a limit to his body. Even if he is chopping firewood, after chopping thousands or tens of thousands of them, his body will not be able to withstand it. Stack him to death? The key is how many people are willing to listen to orders. Meng Fenghu coldly interrupted the general. When Su Qin had been kidnapped by Qi Siren that day, he had become the highest commander of the Chu military. He was from the Meng Marquisate establishment, the first disciple of Meng Fongying, and had even been given a name in the Meng Marquisate establishment. Marquis Meng and his strongest cultivators had died in the Thousand Mountain Formation that had surrounded Ding Ning. Of course, he hated Ding Ning, but while he hated him, some things could not be changed by his will. At a glance, inside and outside the city, only a small number of troops were moving according to the previous orders. Most of them were staying put and leaving their original positions. Ever since he and Zhao Miao appeared here, Ding Ning had not said anything about attacking or taking over the Chu capital. But he was certain that today, they would not just lose this city. Back in Chongling, Wang Jingming had been defeated because there were too many cultivators in the world who wanted to kill him. Some of the troops loyal to Yuanwu and Zheng Xiu risked their lives to fill in because Wang Jingming and the Bazinkindo ground had been accused of many crimes. However, time was ultimately the best detergent. Right now, most likely, even the ordinary old soldiers in the city knew what had happened back then and who had wronged who. Now, each of Ding Ning's sword strikes was a constant reminder to everyone in the city. Without tens of thousands of soldiers risking their lives to fill in, who could defeat the person standing on the city gate tower? A green-robed grandmaster jumped onto the city gate tower at this time. Most people in the new imperial city of the Chu capital did not know his name. They only knew that he had been Su Qin's personal attendant, sent by the Chongling Imperial Palace to protect Su Qin's safety. So it was not hard to speculate. He should be one of Zheng Xiu's trusted aides, and likely had the use of monitoring Su Qin in the Chu capital. So when he appeared, many people who had been numbed from shock suddenly became nervous. This green-robed grandmaster was definitely one of the strongest grandmasters in the city right now. Hengshan, Su Mayan. The green-robed grandmaster announced his identity. What followed was an unimaginably heavy black sword light. The roof tiles on the city gate tower that had not been damaged in the previous battle shattered when his sword light fell. Yet, Ding Ning just gently returned a blow. The sword light from the last flower remnant sword was extremely light, like a breeze in spring. This green-robed grandmaster grunted. Before he could use his power, blood erupted from his chest. He could not raise the black sword light in his hand and smashed it down in front of him. This is the spring mud sword essence of clear, distant sword school. Such a blow can defeat my black Kuei sword? Waves of intense pain traveled into the mind of this cyan-robed grandmaster. He looked at the blood spurting out in front of him in disbelief. Other than the sword move itself, what puzzled him even more was that there was no reaction from the sky. There was no spark as he had imagined. Just now, when he used that blow, he had completely activated the presence connected to the mistress of Chongling. In his thinking, the mistress of Chongling would definitely give the strongest attack of her life. Ding Ning was invincible right now, but he was just Realm 7. He was certain that after these years, Zheng Xiu's power had surpassed any Grandmaster of Chongling in the past. If Zheng Xiu unleashed the strongest attack she had ever unleashed in her life, coupled with his full-powered sword strike, there might be an opportunity that could be exploited. Yet no spark fell. Could it be that even she was afraid? Or perhaps even she would feel remorseful and not want to meet him face to face? This green-robed Grandmaster could not understand. His body fell heavily into the river. Amidst the sound of water, an imperceptible singing came from the distant river. It was a woman's voice. Her voice was graceful with a hint of laziness, but it also gave off an unruly and unyielding aura. In just an instant, many people in the city knew who had arrived. In the military camp in the city, the armor of the generals on the wooden tower vibrated again. The corner of the mouth of the general who had said that he must kill Ding Ning was twitching uncontrollably. Even Bai Shanshui had come to see the spectacle. Who knew how many grandmasters would come? Previously, it was a joke to say that they would pile Ding Ning to death. Chapter 774. Bai Shanshui had arrived. Her figure appeared on the river. As she sang, white waves surged on the river's surface. At a glance, it seemed to reach the horizon. She stood on a white river dolphin that was 10 feet long. It was also a strange creature that she had tamed in some unknown body of water. She had not come alone. Standing beside her was Li Yunrui. There was no place for Li Yunrui in the Chu capital. Even in the former Chu palace, no one knew that Li Yunrui had once been the Chu emperor's most trusted death soldier. So standing next to Bai Shanshui, looking at the murderous Chu capital, Li Yunrui's gaze was filled with emotion. But more of it was shock. He and Bai Shanshui did not know that Ding Ning had come here. They had sensed the energy eruption in the distance, and had been alarmed by Zhao Ci's sword. They had rushed here as fast as they could. Arriving here, they found that Ding Ning was challenging a city alone. He and Bai Shanshui could not match such spirit. Zhao Ci was very far away. She could not hear Bai Shanshui's singing, but the energy vibrations of the entire river let her know of Bai Shanshui's arrival. She turned to look in the direction of the Chu capital, and a warm smile appeared at the corners of her mouth. Even though the Qi emperor had ordered the grandmasters of the Qi dynasty to not pursue Bai Shanshui before he abdicated, his prestige was limited. For the cultivators of the Qi dynasty, the 12 shamans were too important. So up until now, Bai Shanshui and Li Yunrui were still being pursued by the cultivators of the Qi dynasty. But Bai Shanshui had still come. Bai Shanshui had come because she did not know what had happened and was worried about her safety. In this world, it was enough to have such a soulmate who could go through life and death together. Zhao Ci Mr. Zhao Miao paused slightly. She smiled warmly and slowly looked up into the sky. Ding Ning could see that she had thoughts of retiring. She would retire from the Jianghu for a long time and not interfere in the conflicts of the world. But only she knew. She still had a battle destined by fate. Large rivers had upstream and downstream. Some went against the current, while others went down with the current. In the upper reaches of the Chu capital, there was an entrance to the river. The wide river was forcibly constrained into a gourd mouth by the mountain. The current here was rapid, and there were several sharp bends. Unless one was an old boatman who was familiar with this beach, it would be very difficult to pass through safely. In the narrowest section of the riverbed, on one side of the riverbank, there was a pile of broken wood from ships. They were the size of houses, but their color was extremely dark due to being soaked in water. On one of the ebony pieces, an old man was quietly waiting. He was holding an oil paper umbrella, blocking the water vapor that was falling on him and also blocking out the sunlight. Downstream. Regardless of whether it was the battle between Zhao Ci and Ding Ning or Bai Shanshui's arrival, there were energy vibrations in the river that cultivators could feel. However, when it came to him, it strangely regained its calm. There seemed to be a strange power on his body that suppressed all the aura changes downstream. A small boat suddenly broke through the waves, like a sharp sword cutting through the numerous dangerous coves, and quickly broke into his line of sight. The bottom of the boat touched the reefs in the water, but was unharmed and did not make any sound. Because there was a layer of glowing water flowing at the bottom of the boat, unrelated to the flow of the river. The old man holding the umbrella was not surprised at all, because the people on the boat were the people he was waiting for. "I do not want you to pass." When his voice rang out, the small boat had already stopped, leaning against the shore not far in front of him. There were two people on the boat. A plainly dressed woman stood at the bow of the boat. A man wrapped in a thin blanket leaned against the cabin. The plainly dressed woman was Yi Sealing. The man was Bailey Sushua. The old man holding the umbrella was Su Fu, who had left and returned. Not long ago, he had escorted Yuanwu back to Guangzhou. Yi Sealing did not respond. She just slightly adjusted the position of the bow, causing the small boat to be stuck in the cracks of some rocks. This action only meant one thing. If she fought, she may not be able to take care of this small boat. Regardless of overseas or after returning to Chongling, you have improved greatly, but you are still not a match for me. Su Fu raised the umbrella slightly, glanced at Yi Sealing, and said. Then his gaze landed on Bailey Sushua. "Other than you, in Min Mountain Sword Sect, I only fear Yintai Guanjian." Bailey Sushua looked coldly at him and did not argue. He nodded naturally and said, "Yintai Guanjian's quick sword was targeted at you. You ate the poison dragon pill in the early years overseas and are immune to poisons. Gung Run and the others cannot do anything to you." Su Fu nodded. Then he raised the umbrella and looked at the forest above. He said calmly, "Come out." The voice echoed in the forest as though a wind was blowing. But no one responded and no one came out. "Ji Qingqing, the Lady of Chun, has been protecting you because you spoke for her. But she is not as good as Yi Sealing and cannot stop me." Su Fu didn't think much of it. He looked at the mountain forest and said, "That's right." Bailey Sushua looked at him and suddenly laughed. "And then?" Su Fu said slowly and seriously, "In reality, I do not want to kill you." Bailey Sushua did not respond and waited for him to continue. "I just do not want you to interfere in the matters between him and the Holy One." Su Fu said even more slowly, "At least, we are old friends. I do not want to kill you with my own hands. You should know, in all of Chongling, only I can stop you and kill you. If we are not on the same page, I see that you are struggling to speak." Bailey Sushua shook his head and put away his smile. He said, "You had a fortuitous encounter overseas before we became famous, and your constitution is very different from us ordinary cultivators. For a long time, you were the strongest in Chongling. You are strong, but you say that only you can stop us and kill us. Do not speak too confidently. If you speak too confidently, I do not believe you." Bailey Sushua's voice grew colder. "Since you say you can kill us, then come and kill us." Su Fu sighed. He was not faking it. He was truly sighing. As he sighed, a figure suddenly appeared in the shadows behind him and flew towards the forest above. That figure's aura was very strong. Clearly, he was also a Realm 7. But the way he appeared was extremely strange, like he came out of the air. This figure had a colorful face, but his eyes were pale and empty. Most importantly, the aura emanating from this man's body was identical to Su Fu's. Or more accurately, Su Fu's life bond energy seemed to pour into this person's body like it was pouring into a seal weapon. Chapter 775. Without a doubt, this was a strange method. That figure did not look like a living person and felt like a puppet controlled by Su Fu. However, the aura of this puppet was much stronger than the average Realm 7 Grandmaster. Some of the Grandmasters of the Qi dynasty had methods of controlling corpses. But even Yin Ying's disciple Qian Mu, when he used this method, he only used the energies left in the bodies of the Grandmasters. It was equivalent to using his own life bond energy and the energies of the Grandmasters that had not dissipated to create something like a seal weapon. Qianmu's method was the best in the Qi dynasty, but he could not make the controlled corpse as strong as when he was alive. Su Fu's methods were practically unheard of in the world of cultivators. The unknown easily caused people to feel terror. Yet looking at that strange figure, Yi Siling, who had not spoken all this time, said with slight disdain, "It is a pity that the Qi emperor does not know of your inheritance. Otherwise, he would not have dared to make such a deal with Zheng Xiu." Her words had deeper meaning. Regardless of whether it was when he led the army to defeat the Han, Zhao, and Wei on the Bazinkindo ground, or when Yuanwu ascended the throne, Su Fu was undoubtedly the most mysterious of all the nobles and grandmasters of Chongling. He had cultivated in 2 cultivation places in Chongling. Everyone knew that he was a grandmaster, and many people even felt that he was the strongest of all the grandmasters of Chongling back then. The person who made such a judgment was undoubtedly a grandmaster who had a chance to fight with him. But he had almost never fought in Chongling. Or rather, those who had fought with him were all dead. Especially after he had been overseas for many years and managed the overseas voyages of the Qin dynasty and searched for immortal medicines for the Yuanwu emperor. This caused people to not know his true strength. But Yi Siling had also cultivated overseas for a long time. She had had some interactions with Su Fu, and even occasionally saw the seas that the Qin dynasty's armored fleets had cleared. She had seen the remains of some unusually powerful sea beasts after they were killed. In those places that could be called sea battlefields, she had sensed some unusually powerful presences that were different from the cultivators of Chongling. She even suspected that Su Fu was also a cultivator who cultivated the Yin and ghost techniques, but his aura was completely different from the aura of all the cultivators of the various sects in Great Qi, which made her unable to make a definite judgment. Until today, when she saw Su Fu fight with his full strength with her own eyes, she finally understood who Su Fu's true master was. She finally understood why Zheng Xiu was able to gather all the 12 shaman godheads, and even had the array pivot that could control the array within. The technique that Su Fu used at this moment was the Tiger Roar technique that was clearly recorded in some of the books in the Bazinkindo ground. This was a secret technique that originated from the sorcerer ancestor of the Great Qi dynasty. After the death of the shaman ancestor, his disciples were torn apart. Some of them stole the heads of the 12 shamans and escaped. The Tiger Roar technique belonged to one of the witch ancestor's direct disciples among the defectors. That witch ancestor's disciple was torn apart, and the 12 shaman god heads disappeared. As a result, the truly powerful methods of the witch ancestor were lost in the Great Qi dynasty. Yet no one would have thought that a bureau chief of the Qin dynasty was of the voodoo progenitor's branch, and had truly inherited some of the voodoo progenitor's secret arts. His method was naturally above all the Qi sections. Su Fu heard Yi Siling's words clearly. But so what? There were many things in the world where there was a cause and effect. It was impossible to create something out of nothing. It was all part of a chain. Also, many things in the world, the so-called fate of the heavens, were always in the hands of the strongest people of this era. He did not lie. He was not a person who liked to kill, and never felt that killing could solve problems. Especially if he killed Bailey Su Xue. Then all of the living people of Min Mountain Sword Sect would madly seek revenge. The people of Min Mountain Sword Sect were the most talented. These people were usually like quiet serpents resting in the deep waters. But when they were angry and wild, their potential would be squeezed to the limit, and they would become even more terrifying existences. Bai Shanshui and Zhao Si were examples. If the Wei and Zhao had not died, even if Bai Shanshui and Zhao Si had astounding accomplishments, they would not be so strong at this age. He did not want to kill Bailey Su Xue. But what other choice did he have? If Bailey Su Xue and Ding Ning encountered each other, and Bailey Su Xue was healed from his wounds and survived, it would not be as simple as the two of them working together. Who knew if the two of them would be able to increase each other's cultivation by leaps and bounds? He was even certain that if these two people met, the time it would take for them to reach Realm 8 would be greatly shortened. If these two people reached Realm 8, then when they entered Chongling, no one would be able to stop them from working together. So Bailey Su Xue had to die here. Right now, Bailey Sushiwa was seriously wounded and could not fight. It was not easy for him to hang on to his life. A female master of the Qin country, and Yi Sealing he was familiar with, in his view, could not change anything. His white eyebrows rose slightly. There was a soft sound. Another figure flew out of the air covered by the shadow behind him. This was another tiger helper. His body looked no different from a normal person, but his skin and flesh were colorful from inside to outside due to the use of medicine and life bond energy. As their vital energy flowed, they gave off a sound like a tiger's roar. This was the origin of the name, Tiger Helper. This Tiger Helper was like his life bond item. Most importantly, other cultivators only had one life bond item, but he had more than one Tiger Helper. Also, this tiger/art was passed down to his generation, and he merged it with the medicine slave methods of Jiaodong Commandery. It was even stronger than the tiger/art of the voodoo ancestor back then. If Wang Jingming was the recognized head of the sword in the world, then in the past, when he and Zheng Xiu secretly made a deal, his power was enough for him to be above all the cultivators of the Qi and become the head of the cultivators who cultivated yin and ghost energies. When the second tiger helper flew out according to his thoughts and landed on Yi Sealing on the stone beach in front of him, the first tiger helper had already landed in the dense forest above. When the presence of the tiger helper swept through the forest, all the grass and trees withered, and all the leaves turned yellow. Countless yellow leaves scattered in the sky like snow. Yi Sealing frowned slightly. Her gaze did not land on the second tiger helper, but rather on the person behind Su Fu. The shadow behind Su Fu twisted again, as though another person was going to come out. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.